It starts when Calypso has Ulysses trapped on the island of Aegea for 7 years, and all the gods are in Jove's house at Olympus and are debating what to do with him. I read the Samuel Butler translation, so throughout this video you'll hear me use the Latin equivalent names. It's Odysseus in Greek and Ulysses in Roman, although most of the characters' names stay the same. So all of them are there except Neptune, who by this point in the story doesn't like Ulysses that much. He's at a festival with the Ethiopians. The first third of the Odyssey is basically a flash forward. So Jove speaks up and he says, "Remember Aegisthus? How Mercury told him not to sleep with Agamemnon's wife, and then he did it anyway, and he killed Agamemnon. And people like this blame us for their problems, when they're the ones actually causing them." Minerva, she's the Roman equivalent to Athena, says that we aren't talking about Aegisthus, we're talking about Ulysses. Ulysses is sad and lonely, and he just wants to get home, and he was pious when he was at Troy, so they should really help him out. Jove then agrees with Minerva, but reminds her that Ulysses really pissed off Neptune when he blinded Polyphemus the Cyclops, but he's still on Ulysses' side. They agree to have Mercury go tell Calypso that she needs to let him go, and Minerva sets off to deal with a group of unruly characters who in the meanwhile have been trying to court Ulysses' wife, Penelope. When she arrives on Ulysses' home island of Ithaca, she disguises herself as Mintes, one of his old friends. These suitors are not behaving themselves very well. They're making a mess of Ulysses' home and they're eating all of his livestock. Ulysses' son, Telemachus, isn't doing anything about it, and he's thinking about how great it would be if Ulysses was back home, so he could kick all these people out of his house. Telemachus sees Minerva disguised as Mintes, and he says, "Hey, come in and have some food and tell me what you're here for." So they go into his house and they eat some food together, but then all the suitors suddenly show up, and they're singing and dancing and having a great time. This annoys Telemachus, who says to Minerva,
"Singing comes cheap to those who do not pay for it, and all this is done at the cost of one whose bones lie rotting in some wilderness or grinding to powder in the surf. If these men were to see my father come back to Ithaca, they would pray for longer legs rather than a longer purse, for money would not serve them."
But the thing is, it's been 20 years. Everyone basically thinks Ulysses is dead. So Telemachus asks Minerva, who's disguised as Mintes, who they are, and Minerva says that she is the king of the Taphians and a friend of Ulysses. She asks Telemachus who all these guests are, and observes how nobody brought any of their own food to this gathering. She asks if there is some kind of wedding going on, and why everyone in the house is behaving so terribly. Telemachus answers by lamenting the fact that he doesn't actually know for certain whether or not Ulysses died at the sacking of Troy, or whether he's still alive somewhere. These suitors are just living in their house, trying to court Penelope, who isn't saying that she will or won't marry anyone, because she's secretly holding out on the hope that Ulysses is actually still alive, all the while these suitors squat in her house. Minerva says to him, "If Ulysses is still Ulysses, he would make short work of these guys. But you should actually try and get rid of these people yourself. Call an assembly tomorrow morning and tell everyone that you need these guys out of your house. After that, I'll give you a ship and 20 men so you can set off in search of your father. You should check out the island of Pylos and find Nestor, and then go to the king of Sparta, Menelaus. They were at Troy with Ulysses, so if anyone knew what happened to him, it's gonna be them. And if he turns out to be dead, you'll have a funeral, Penelope will marry again, and you'll kill all the suitors because you're 20 years old. You can kill these people yourself if you really have to. Remember that Aegisthus guy? Agamemnon's son, Orestes, killed him, and now everyone loves Orestes. You want to be popular like him, right? Now get to work." Telemachus is very grateful for all this. He asks Mintes to stay, but Minerva insists upon leaving. Telemachus is then thinking, yeah, that was definitely some kind of god I was just talking to back there. But I am going to do some stuff. I've had my call to action. So he gets to work, and he moves over to all the suitors. This singer called Thymius is singing about the return journey the other heroes from Troy went on, and as that's happening, Penelope walks down the stairs. She's wearing a veil, and she's crying because the song reminds her of her ill-fated husband, so she asks Thymius to play something cheerier instead. Telemachus tells his mom to get over it, and that other people surely died on the return from Troy, and that she shouldn't boss men around. She leaves, and he turns to the suitors, and tells them that they can finish their meal, but when morning comes he'll formally tell them to leave, and they'll have to eat at each other's houses instead. The most insufferable of all the suitors, Antinous, replies, "That's a lot of talk, but Jove willing, you're never going to be king like your father was." Telemachus brushes it off, and basically says that he just wants all of these people to leave his house. Another suitor, Eurymachus, asks who that stranger who just left was, and Telemachus tells him that it was just good old Mintes, and that his father is definitely dead, and nothing crazy is going on. But secretly, he's pretty sure that it was actually Minerva in disguise, and he's not exactly certain if Ulysses is actually dead or not. So the suitors enjoy their merriment for the rest of the evening and go back to their own houses when night falls. Telemachus sleeps up in this tower in the outer court of the property, so he goes up to his room and he's got a lot on his mind, thinking about what journeys lie ahead of him. He gives his shirt to Ulysses' wet nurse, Eurycleia, and he goes to sleep. Morning comes, and Telemachus has everyone called to a big meeting, and Minerva intervened to make his appearance especially attractive for the occasion. This was the first assembly that had been called since Ulysses left 20 years ago, so expectations are high. Telemachus starts the meeting by complaining about these dastardly suitors, and he says that he'd take care of them himself if he were the man Ulysses was, but that he could never be of that stature. He asks for help from everyone gathered round, and then he starts crying. The suitors feel no empathy. Antinous insults Telemachus, and complains about how Penelope had been deceiving them. Penelope has been weaving an ornate funeral shroud to honor the passing of Ulysses, but every night she disassembles part of it so that she never makes any real progress, and in this way she can remain faithful to her husband. Antinous is really upset about this, and he promises to continue to abuse their home, so long as Penelope is available. Telemachus isn't going to have any of this, so he tells Antinous that he's not kicking his mother out of his father's house, that he foresees the death of Antinous in this house. And as he's saying this, 2 eagles, animals which are associated with Jove, fly down, glare at the people below, fight each other, and leave. The prophet Halitherses interprets this as the imminent return of Ulysses, and bad news for the suitors. Eurymachus says, "Go away. That's not real. Nothing ever happens. Don't listen to him. Actually, there's birds flying around in the sky all the time, and it doesn't mean anything. It's definitely just a coincidence. Ulysses is dead. You should be dead. Shut up." After saying all that, Eurymachus refutes Telemachus' request and says that the more he complains, the more the suitors will just hate him, and that there's nothing he can do to change their behavior. Telemachus is done arguing. He tells everyone, "Remember the gods who are watching, and waiting to enact their justice. In the meantime, I'm going to be off looking for my father." After this, a good friend of Ulysses, Mentor, who had authority over his property and Ulysses' slaves, rose to speak against the insolence of the crowd.
"Hear me, men of Ithaca. I hope that you may never have a kind and well-disposed ruler any more, nor one who will govern you equitably. I hope that all your chiefs henceforward may be cruel and unjust, for there is not one of you but has forgotten Ulysses, who ruled you as though he were your father. I am not half so angry with the suitors, for if they choose to do violence in the naughtiness of their hearts and wager their heads that Ulysses will not return, they can take the high hand and eat up his estate. But as for you others, I am shocked at the way in which you all sit still without even trying to stop such scandalous goings on which you could do if you chose, for you are many and they are few."
And so someone responds to Mentor, "Well, there's so many of the suitors, there would definitely be a lot of bloodshed if we were to take them on, even if Ulysses were here. So what can we really do about it?" By the way, Mentor's character is actually the etymological origin of the word mentor, as in an advisor. I thought that was interesting. So the meeting gets broken up, and can you guess where those unruly suitors went? That's right, they went to Ulysses' place and got back to roughing it up. Telemachus went by the beach and prayed to Minerva. Then, Minerva, disguised as Mentor, came upon Telemachus and gave him some words of encouragement. She told him to be out at once, to start his journey swiftly, if he is to prove himself of the same stuff as his father. Telemachus then returned to find the suitors eating his pigs and goats. Antinous offered some food and wine to Telemachus, like they had when Telemachus was younger, but by this point, nothing is going to keep him from going on his quest. All these events aren't going over so well with the suitors. They accurately speculate that Telemachus intends to kill them, and that he may return from Sparta with soldiers, or from Ithaca with poison. But then someone says, "Hey, maybe he'll just die like Ulysses did. Then they could just divide his property and marry his mom." Telemachus visits his father's treasure room, where he calls the slave Eurycleia to him and requests that some of Ulysses' finest wine be sent, as he intends to sail to Pylos in Sparta. Eurycleia starts crying when she hears this, and insists that Telemachus not go searching after his father, because he's certainly dead, and his adventure would only serve to endanger his life. But Telemachus is confident that he has the sanction of the gods on his side, so he assures Eurycleia that he'll be safe, and he has her promise that she won't tell Penelope until some 10 or 12 days have passed, as to keep his mother from worrying. Minerva then personally intervenes by taking the shape of Telemachus and providing words of encouragement to each member of the crew before they departed. The goddess then made all the suitors fall asleep at their drinks, and in the form of Mentor, invited Telemachus to begin his search. They readied the vessel, raised the sails, and set off from the shore. Aboard, the crew made offerings to the gods, especially towards Minerva. So they sail around, and they reach the island of Pylos, and Telemachus is a bit nervous to speak to someone as old and important as King Nestor. Minerva tells him that he'll just figure it out. They show up at Nestor's abode, holding some offerings to Neptune, and then Nestor asks him if they're wanderers or traitors. Telemachus says that he's looking for Ulysses. He wants to know what happened to him, and that Nestor shouldn't smooth over any ugly details of his fate. The king replies and says that they were headed back when there was a dispute between Agamemnon and Menelaus, because Menelaus wanted to head home right off the bat, and Agamemnon wanted to offer up a big sacrifice to Minerva. So they split up. Half the men go with Menelaus, and the other half go with Agamemnon. Ulysses decided to stick with Agamemnon, and Nestor hasn't heard anything of them since he got back. Telemachus brings up his suitors problem, and Nestor provides some words of encouragement, but Telemachus doubts that his father could actually return home, even with the help of the gods. Minerva tells him that if the gods like Ulysses, then he should probably be okay, but the gods can't do everything on their own. Telemachus remains pessimistic, and shifts the subject over to the fate of Agamemnon. Nestor recounts the story. While Agamemnon was away fighting at Troy, Clytemnestra was wooed by Aegisthus. It took some time, as Clytemnestra had a strong character, and a bard had been left to guard her from any suitors. But Aegisthus had this bard abandoned on a desert island, after which Clytemnestra would court him. When Agamemnon finally returned home, Aegisthus killed him and reigned over Mycenae for 8 years. It only ended when the late Agamemnon's son Orestes came home from Athens and slew him. On the same day, Menelaus returned home from his voyage, so if you want to know the whereabouts of Ulysses, he's the one you need to ask, as he's only just returned. They all then drink and observe the sacrificial offering, and Telemachus and Minerva, disguised as Mentor, want to set off for Sparta, but the ever-hospitable Nestor holds them up. Nestor insists that they have some good beds and cloaks which they can use, and Minerva tells him that Telemachus should just go and take one of these beds while the crew sleeps in the ship. She then transforms into an eagle and flies away, astonishing everyone and filling them with confidence in the knowledge that the gods were on their side. So they go and drink some more and make an offering to Minerva, and then they all go to sleep. In the morning, they sacrificed a cow and ate some of it. King Nestor sends Telemachus off to Sparta with a lot of wine and food, with the journey there being mostly uneventful. So Telemachus reaches Sparta, and King Menelaus is holding 2 weddings, one for his son and one for his daughter. It's a nice big wedding, complete with a bard and everything. Telemachus and Nestor's son, Pisistratus, are seen by one of Menelaus' slaves, Eteonius. Eteonius asks Menelaus whether he should tell them off, and Menelaus calls him an idiot and tells Eteonius to receive them like dignified guests. Telemachus and Pisistratus are brought into the courtyard, and they're impressed by how beautiful the house is. They're taken in, cleaned up, and Menelaus greets them.
Fall to, and welcome. When you have done supper, I shall ask who you are, for the lineage of such men as you cannot have been lost. You must be descended from a line of scepter-bearing kings, for poor people do not have such sons as you are.
Telemachus whispers to Pisistratus just how much he admires the house of Menelaus, and Menelaus overhears them, and says that he would gladly have just 1/3 of his riches if it meant that he had never departed to Troy and all of his friends were still alive, chief among them the missing Ulysses. Hearing of his father, Telemachus would cry and shield his face with his cloak. Menelaus wasn't sure if he should continue or ask Telemachus what's wrong, while Helen began to walk down the stairs and take a seat at the dinner table. She wondered who these 2 were and thought that she recognized Telemachus. Menelaus also thinks that this guy is Telemachus, so Pisistratus explains who they are and why they're searching for Ulysses. Menelaus, upon seeing the son of his long-lost friend, laments just how little they have prepared for the visit, and how he should have been spending time with Telemachus in the past. At this, Telemachus, Helen, Menelaus, and Pisistratus all start crying. Pisistratus brings up his brother Antilochus, who died at Troy, which Menelaus praises. The king then tells everyone to stop crying and get back to eating their dinner. Helen then spiked the wine with a drug she got from an Egyptian woman, which is able to keep people in good spirits no matter what, and she began to recount her experience with Ulysses at Troy. Ulysses had entered the city in disguise as a beggar, all full of cuts and bruises, and was only recognized by Helen herself. She questioned him, but Ulysses had her promise that she wouldn't tell the Trojans about his disguise. Menelaus then said, yeah, that sounds about right. Ulysses was quite the character. He remembers a time within the wooden horse, when Helen, who thought that there might be some people hiding inside the horse, and was working for the Trojans at the time, she mimicked the voices of the soldiers' wives to see if anybody would respond. No one did except for the stupid Anticlus, whose voice was muffled at the last second when Ulysses clamped his hands over his mouth. They go to sleep, and the next morning Menelaus asks Telemachus more about his problems, and Telemachus elaborates on the misdeeds of the suitors. The king predicts their fate.
So these cowards would usurp a brave man's bed? A hind might as well lay her newborn young in the lair of a lion, and then go off to feed in the forest or in some grassy dell. The lion, when he comes back to his lair, will make short work with the pair of them. So will Ulysses with these suitors.
In regards to the fate of Ulysses, Menelaus remembers what he heard from the old man of the sea. Back when Menelaus was on his return journey, he was stuck on the Egyptian island of Pharos for 20 days. He and his men only survived through the intervention of the goddess Eidothea, because she just liked Menelaus so much. She told him that if he could find Proteus, also known as the Old Man of the Sea, and her father, then he could learn how to get home, as well as find out about some other going-ons in the world. And the way you get this guy is by waiting until noon, when Proteus rises above the waves and enters his cave. When you come upon Proteus, you have to grab him and hold him tight because he's going to try and transform himself into different kinds of animals, as well as fire and water. But if you just hold him tight enough, you can get the information you want. So Menelaus waited with 3 of his best dudes until noon, wearing some sealskins Idothea brought them, by which they could disguise themselves as his seals. The skins were real stinky though, so Idothea also put some stuff under their noses to get rid of the smell. Come noon, the old man of the sea came up from the water, counted his seals, with Menelaus and his men among them, and he went to sleep. Going according to the plan, the 4 of them seized and held Proteus, as he turned into a lion, a dragon, a leopard, a boar, as he turned into the water, and as he turned into a tree. But despite everything, he wasn't able to shake off the men. Very annoyed, Proteus asked them what they wanted, and Menelaus says, "You know what I want. How do I get home?" Proteus tells him he's gonna have to sacrifice a ton of cows all the way back in Egypt, which is very disappointing to Menelaus because Egypt was a long way back. But Menelaus also asks if all of his friends managed to make it back home, and Proteus is like, "Okay, but you're not gonna want to hear this."
Hello guys. In this course of making this video, my editing style changed a lot. I went back to the start and re-edited up to this point, and intended to fix the entire video, but I ran out of time. If I don't upload anything soon, I will get demonetized for love viewership. Basically, the editing quality is going to drop off a cliff for the next 30 minutes, but it gets better after that. Thank you for your patience. Now, let's get back to the Odyssey.
Remember Ajax the Lesser? The gods tried to kill him at sea, but he escaped to the island of Gyrae, where he then stupidly bragged about how the gods couldn't kill him, so Neptune split the island in half and he drowned. This kind of situation might come up again later in the story. And Agamemnon? Aegisthus saw him coming home, so he had him invited to a feast, where 20 hidden warriors sprang out and, of course, killed him. Menelaus cried after hearing about this, but he also asked what happened to Ulysses. Proteus tells him that Ulysses is, in fact, alive, but is bitterly trapped on Calypso's island with no way to return home. After recounting the story, Menelaus insisted that Telemachus stay another 10 or 12 days, but he wanted to go home, as his men were growing wary. Meanwhile, the suitors are throwing discs in front of Ulysses' house when Noemon asks Antinous if they knew when Telemachus would get back from Pylos. Everyone is surprised when they hear this because they thought that Telemachus was still on Ithaca. Antinous is really concerned when he hears this, and he wants to know everything about Telemachus' journey. He and Eurymachus are pissed off, and Antinous says, "Get me a boat and 20 men. I'm going to wait for Telemachus to get back and kill him as he's passing by." But the servant Medon overheard this whole conversation and relayed it to Penelope, who also didn't know Telemachus had left in the first place. Penelope falls upon the floor and cries, where she is joined in crying by all of the maids of the house. Penelope then goes to Ulysses' father, Laertes, for help so that the people of Ithaca might come to Telemachus' rescue. Euryclea tells her that she knew of Telemachus' quest, but didn't tell her because he made her promise not to. And the maid tells Penelope that she shouldn't bother Laertes because he has a lot on his plate already, and that praying to Minerva is the best thing that she can do. So Penelope stopped crying and went upstairs with her maids and prayed.
Hear me, daughter of Aegis-bearing Jove, unweariable. If ever Ulysses, while he was here, burned you fat thigh bones of sheep or heifer, bear it in mind now as in my favour, and save my darling son from the villainy of the suitors.
As this is happening, the suitors are all feeling very smug, with one of them saying, "Hey, would you get a load of this? The queen is about to marry one of us, and she has no clue that we're about to kill her son." Antinous then tells them to shut up, lest their evil plans be overheard. So he chose 20 men to go after him, and they sailed off. That night, Penelope was drifting off to sleep when Minerva appeared in her room through the appearance of her sister Eupheme. Penelope explained how worried she was for Telemachus, and then the apparition told her that Minerva would be with Telemachus on his journey, and that this vision itself was actually sent by Minerva. Hearing this, Penelope asks if Ulysses is still alive, and the vision says, "I'm not going to tell you that," and it vanishes. But Penelope was feeling much better after this. So after all this happens, the gods hold a second meeting, where Minerva again sympathizes with Ulysses and tells Jove that the suitors now plan to kill Telemachus. But Jove is saying, "Hang on, wasn't it your idea to bring Telemachus to Pylos in the first place? That situation is on you. But let's give Ulysses a hand. Send a raft to Ogygia and tell Calypso to let him go, so that he can sail to the island of Scheria, the home of the Phaeacians, and they can give him a boat to sail back to Ithaca on with a lot of treasure for him." So Jove sends Mercury on a long and exciting flight to the island, and he reaches Ogygia. Calypso asks him why he's here, so Mercury answers, "Jove sent me here. Why else would I fly all the way over here? And you're gonna have to let Ulysses go, whether you like it or not." Calypso is pissed when she hears this. She criticizes the gods for never allowing goddesses to sleep with mortal men, even though they sleep with mortal women all the time. and she also argues that she was only doing what she could to save Ulysses, but still yields to Jove's command. Calypso goes and finds Ulysses on the beach, who misses Ithaca enough to be found crying out loud in despair when she found him. Ulysses would spend the days crying on the beach, longing for home, lamenting how he was forced to sleep with Calypso each night. Calypso goes up to Ulysses and tells him that out of her own free will, she's no longer going to keep him on the island. So she was going to have him cut some wood together to make a raft that could hold some supplies as he sets out. But Ulysses doesn't believe her at first, since such a raft couldn't withstand the seas of such a long journey, but Calypso promises to him that she doesn't mean any kind of harm, and they return to her cave. After a hearty meal, Calypso makes one last effort to convince Ulysses to stay on the island, telling him that his journey will be long and perilous, that Ulysses could be immortal on this island, that she is already far more beautiful than Penelope. But Ulysses insists that he must return to Ithaca, and that he is willing to bear any burden the gods send his way to get there. It was getting late, so they went to sleep, and in the morning Calypso would give Ulysses a large bronze axe with blades on both sides. She also gave him another woodcutting tool similar to an axe, and brought him to the best trees on the island. He cut down 20 trees, which he promptly fashioned into the wood of the raft. With the help of Calypso, they had the vessel finished in 4 days. Then, when the time finally came, Ulysses at last departed from Aegina and was once again heading toward Ithaca. Ulysses is finally on his way back home. Things are going his way again, but things never go Ulysses' way for long. He sailed day after day, until eventually he saw the Phaeacian coast on the horizon. But on a far-off mountain, Neptune spotted him. He said to himself,
"Good heavens, so the gods have been changing their minds about Ulysses while I was away in Ethiopia, and now he is close to the land of the Phaeacians, where it is decreed that he shall escape from the calamities that have befallen him. Still, he shall have plenty of hardship yet before he is done with it."
Neptune uses his trident to summon all the terrible winds of the earth, and creates an enormous storm to doom Ulysses. Upon seeing this, our hero is utterly despaired. He only wishes that he had just died among his peers at Troy, to be buried and remembered. A huge wave threw Ulysses off the raft, and he was kept underwater for a while. But he swam up, spitting out the salt water as he focused on the one thing he needed to survive, the raft. Fighting against the waves, Ulysses eventually managed to climb back on board. A great many of his friends died from drowning, and Ulysses would not be among them. Yet the storm would only ravage the raft with greater and greater intensity, until the marine goddess Ino saw this and took mercy on him. Her elegant form leapt from the waves and sat on the raft amidst the horrible storm. She questioned why Neptune would take such harsh judgment against a man like Ulysses, and took note of his ability to survive whatever was thrown at him. Ino tells him that if he takes off all of his clothes, adorns her veil, and swims to the Phaeacian coast, then he would be able to survive. She only asks that he throw it back into the ocean when he's done with it. And so she gives him her veil, and without exchanging any words with him, she dives back down into the sea. Ulysses isn't immediately convinced. With these gods trying to kill him, he smells deception coming from Ino's generosity. He decides that he'll stick to his raft for as long as possible, and when it's destroyed by the winds, only then will he try to swim for the Phaeacian coast. But just as he decides this, an enormous wave completely destroys his raft, leaving Ulysses clinging to a single plank in the dark broad sea. He took his clothes off and adorned the veil, swimming in the direction of the shore. Neptune saw this, and he was annoyed, but he decided that Ulysses had been punished enough for now. The god continued about his business. It is here that Minerva would intervene once more, killing the winds except for those in Ulysses' direction. For 2 days the winds carried him, until upon the 3rd day he saw land in the distance.
Then, as children rejoice when their dear father begins to get better after having for a long time borne sore affliction sent him by some angry spirit, but the gods deliver him from evil, so was Ulysses thankful when he saw land and trees, and swam with all his strength that he might once more set foot upon dry ground.
But Ulysses' troubles were far from over. Once he got close enough to hear the shore, he heard the sound of the waves breaking against some really nasty rocks. He would again despair, seeing the rocks as certain death, and fearing that if he swam around them, he would be carried out to sea, or the gods might summon a sea monster to come and kill him. But he wouldn't have to worry about that fate, because a powerful wave took hold of him and slammed him against the jagged shore. He would have died, but at the last moment Minerva made him grab the rock with his hands at just the right angle. He was in great pain as the force of the wave pressed his body against the rock, and had sucked back with such force that his grip was completely shredded and bloodied. Again, he was heaved underwater through the great power of the ocean, where if Minerva had not calmed his mind, he would have panicked and drowned. He began to swim outward, looking for some way inland around the rocks, until eventually he found the mouth of a river. With a prayer to the gods to part him safe passage, Ulysses was finally brought inland. After so long at the mercy of the waves, his strong body was completely destroyed. He fell to the floor, swollen, weak, incapable of breathing or speaking, with his nostrils and mouth leaking salt water. After some time laying upon the ground, Ulysses felt his strength return to him. And then, remembering how he was saved by the intervention of Ino, he throws the veil into the mouth of the river, where the friendly goddess leapt up and caught it. This being dealt with, he could finally be free of the ocean, at least for a time. Ulysses kissed the earth. But then he starts to think, where do I go from here? He could quickly succumb to exposure, and he feared heading into the wilderness defenseless as he was, as he would be an easy target for any hungry predator. But ultimately, he decided to head into the woods, where he found a thicket protecting him from the wind and the rain. Here, he would gather a large mound of dead leaves and covered himself with them. Laying down, Minerva sent him off to sleep and relieved him of the memories of his painful journey. So Ulysses is sleeping, and Minerva decides to go inland and visit the Phaeacians. These Phaeacian guys used to live in this place called Hyperia, but they were attacked by Cyclopes, so they had to move over here to Scheria, an island that's kind of on the outskirts. Minerva entered the house of King Alcinous and approached his daughter Nausicaa while disguised as one of her friends. She criticized how messy her room was, and how messy all her clothes were, so she suggests to Nausicaa that tomorrow they go and wash her clothes. The next day, Nausicaa would ask King Alcinous to borrow a wagon and mules with which she'd clean everyone's clothes, and he obliges, so she sets off along with some of her maids. They arrive at the river, they wash their clothes, and while they're waiting for their clothes to dry, they wash themselves, they eat some food, and they played around with a ball as Nausicaa sang for them. But then, Nausicaa threw the ball to one of the handmaids, but she didn't catch it and it lands in the river. This causes all of the handmaids to make a ruckus, and by the work of Minerva, it was this noise that awoke Ulysses, who was sleeping in the leaves nearby. He wonders who exactly these people are. Are these civilized people, or are they savages? He breaks off a branch to cover himself, and he goes to see them. When the maids saw him, they ran away at the sight of his wild, roughed-up appearance, all except for Nausicaa, who through the intervention of Minerva, bravely stood her ground. Ulysses ponders, should I throw myself at her feet, or ask for some clothes? He decides that's just best to ask her for some clothes. He explains that he sailed from the Ogygian island, that he had been long tormented by the sea, and that he only needs to be shown the path to her city and get a garment to cover himself up with. Ulysses said this after asking whether she was the goddess Diana, and thoroughly praising her beauty. Nausicaa was receptive to his flattery and flowery prose. She tells him that her name is Nausicaa, that she is the daughter of King Alcinous, and that they will receive him hospitably. She then directs her maids to bathe him and get him some food, and they obliged, but Ulysses directs the women to turn away as he bathed himself, as he felt embarrassed. After he was done bathing and dressing himself, Minerva made him appear taller, stronger, and more beautiful than he was at first. She grew his hair to be thicker and had it come down in curls. When she saw him in this state, Nausicaa became convinced that Ulysses had been sent by the gods themselves to visit the Phaeacians. She finds herself longing for a husband such as him. The princess invited Ulysses to come with her and her maids to her father's house, but requests that he wait at a little garden when they're approaching the town, and sit around for a while as Nausicaa and the maids enter first. She fears the controversy and scandal that might come with her bringing a strange man home from her expedition, especially considering the fact that she's unmarried. She tells him how to find her father's house from there, and that if he wants to get home he needs to ask her mother, Queen Arete, for help. She's more sympathetic than her husband. And so Nausicaa drove the wagon further into Scheria, Ulysses following behind. When they came upon the garden, he sat and prayed to Minerva that he might find friendship among the Phaeacians. Minerva did hear his prayer, but she made no acknowledgement to Ulysses out of fear of her uncle Neptune. And so Nausicaa returned to her father's house and to her chambers while Ulysses waited. When the time came for him to enter the town, Minerva put some mist around him so that he would not be bothered by any other Phaeacians. As he entered the town, Minerva approached him in the form of a young girl carrying a bucket. Ulysses asked her if she knew where Alcinous' place was, and she said she'd bring him there. Minerva explained to him that these Phaeacians aren't extremely keen on strangers, so it would be wise for him to keep his mouth shut. They walked through the city, giving Ulysses plenty of opportunity to view their pretty ships, their harbors, their courtyards, and their impressive walls. At last they came upon Alcinous' house, and Minerva again told him to look for Queen Arete before she left Ulysses and the island altogether for Athens. Ulysses entered the palace, and he spent a moment gazing around the heavily garnished building. He examined the outer courtyard, rich with pear trees, apple trees, pomegranate trees, and big round olives. In this special environment, the fruits never spoil because of the softness of the air. Further exploring the house, Ulysses came upon a group of high-ranking Phaeacians making drink sacrifices to Mercury. He was still obscured by Minerva's blessing, so nobody was able to see him as he walked through the courtyard and towards the king and queen. Ulysses placed his hands upon the knees of the queen, causing his invisibility to disappear. Now everyone is shocked that this random man suddenly appeared before the king and queen, but Ulysses wasted no time to make his request. He was pretty quick to the point, delivering only a little adulation to the queen as he asked for her help in getting back to Ithaca. Ulysses then proceeded to sit down by the floor of the fireplace, as the Phaeacian elder Achenius, an old hero and a great speaker, addressed Alcinous. "Come on, we're all waiting to hear what you have to say. Let's give the stranger some food and a decent chair to sit on." Alcinous took Ulysses' hand and gave him the seat of Laodamas, his favorite son, and gave him some food and drink. The king decides that they'll talk about sending Ulysses home tomorrow after a sacrificial banquet, and that they'll see to it he is properly escorted and unharmed throughout his journey. But Alcinous is also wondering whether Ulysses might be some kind of god in disguise. So Ulysses assures him that he's mortal, and that he really wants to eat his food. He told everyone to get to work getting everything together at next daybreak, for he would only be content to die after seeing his house once again. Everyone agreed. They liked this guy, and they got to eating. After they were done feasting, only Ulysses, Alcinous, and Arete were at the table, while the servants cleaned up after them. Arete recognized Ulysses' clothes as the design of her and her maids, so she asked him where he found them. Instead of giving a direct answer, he began to explain his whole story. How he was shipwrecked onto the island of Aegina and held captive by Calypso for 7 years, how she let him go on a little raft, how it was destroyed by Neptune. He skips mentioning Ino, and describes how he was almost killed by the rocks, and how he swam into the river, and how Nausicaa found him and gave him the clothes he was wearing at that moment. Alcinous is impressed hearing all this, so he asks him to marry his daughter and become his son-in-law. But Ulysses was only interested in getting home, which Alcinous was fine with. The queen then had her maids make a bed for Ulysses in the gatehouse, which he slept in that night. So the next morning, Alcinous and Ulysses both wake up and head down to the Phaeacian assembly place, while Minerva takes the form of a servant, and she goes around waking everyone up and telling them to head down to the assembly place to see this Ulysses guy. Alcinous tells everyone that Ulysses is a stranger who needs a boat to get home, so he says that they need to get a feast and a boat ready. 52 oarsmen prepared Ulysses' vessel for him, while Alcinous slaughtered 12 sheep, 8 pigs, and 2 oxen. After this, a servant brought the famous blind bard Demodocus, showed him where to sit, and gave him his lyre. Now that everyone was here, they ate a bunch of food, and Demodocus began to sing. He sang of the discord between Ulysses and Achilles, and how Agamemnon liked to see this because it was foretold to him by an oracle. The bard sang about how this was the beginning of the end for both the Achaeans and the Trojans. Hearing of his old friends, so many of whom suffered terribly, Ulysses couldn't help but cry, so he covered his face out of embarrassment. Eventually the bard stopped singing, and Ulysses uncovered his face, but when the audience pressed the bard to continue, Ulysses cried again. Only Alcinous noticed this, which is why he insisted Demodocus stop playing and they have some athletic games instead. And of course King Alcinous also wanted Ulysses to see just how great the Phaeacians were at boxing, wrestling, jumping, and running, so that he could spread the good word. And so they all made their way to see these competitions, where a crowd of many thousand people had gathered. They had a foot race, and this guy named Clatonius came in first. There was a wrestling competition, and Euryalus was the best at that. They jumped, and Amphialus was the best jumper, while Elatrius was the best disc thrower. Alcinous' favorite son Laodamas, the one Ulysses took the seat of, was the best at boxing. And this guy was curious to see just what physical prowess Ulysses possessed. Laodamas discussed the powerful frame of his body with Euryalus, and mentioned that the sea might have whittled him down. So Euryalus tells Laodamas that that may be the case, and he should ask Ulysses himself, which he does. So Laodamas goes up to Ulysses and says, "Hey, you seem like you could do pretty well in one of these sports. Your ship is already prepared and everything, so you should have some fun." But Ulysses wasn't interested. He explained that he only wanted to return home, and didn't want to bother himself with any of these games, which really upset Euryalus.
I gather then that you are unskilled in any of the many sports that men generally delight in. I suppose you are one of those grasping traders that go about in ships as captains or merchants, and who think of nothing but their outward freights and homeward cargoes. There does not seem to be much of the athlete about you.
This was a terrible mistake on the part of Euryalus. Ulysses said to him,
"For shame, sir, you are an insolent fellow. So true is it that the gods do not grace all men alike in speech, person, and understanding. One man may be of weak presence, but heaven has adorned this with such a good conversation that he charms everyone who sees him. His honeyed moderation carries his hearers with him, so that he is leader in all assemblies of his fellows. And wherever he goes, he is looked up to. Another may be as handsome as a god, but his good looks are not crowned with discretion. This is your case. No god could make a finer looking fellow than you are, but you are a fool. Your ill-judged remarks have made me exceedingly angry, and you are quite mistaken, for I excel in a great many athletic exercises. Indeed, so long as I had youth and strength, I was among the first athletes of the age. Now, however, I am worn out by labor and sorrow, for I have gone through much both on the field of battle and by the waves of the weary sea. Still, in spite of all this, I will compete, for your taunts have stung me to the quick.
Without even taking his cloak off, Ulysses grabbed the disc, which was much bigger and heavier than the regular discs, and he threw it farther than any of the Phaeacians managed with their smaller ones. In the form of a spectator, Minerva appeared and began to glaze him.
A blind man, sir, could easily tell your mark by groping for it. It is so far ahead of any other.
Hearing this, Ulysses felt pretty good about himself. Now he was challenging the Phaeacians to any manner of sport with anyone present, except for Laodamas, because he was his host and he thought that it would be inappropriate. And he did mention that a Phaeacian might potentially beat him at running, but only because he was so recently beaten up by the ocean. Like, if he was in his prime, he would have beaten them at everything. Nobody says anything, except for Alcinous, who's happy to see Ulysses willing to compete, and he apologizes for Euryalus' rudeness. He also wanted Ulysses to understand that the Phaeacians might not honestly be the best wrestlers or boxers around, but they're great at running, sailing, music, and dance. To emphasize this, he had someone go get Demodocus' lyre for him so he could play some more. Once Demodocus got to playing, a bunch of Phaeacians danced with elegance on the court before them, which impressed Ulysses. Demodocus began to sing a story about Mars, Venus, and Vulcan. Mars had been coming on to Venus, and so she cheated on her husband Vulcan with him. Vulcan was pissed when he heard about this, so he forged some powerful chains and hid them above his bed. Later, when Mars stopped by, he went to bed with Venus, but the two of them became trapped by the chains. Vulcan returned upon the two of them stuck there, and he was furious, so he called all of the other gods to see what happened. When they get there, they all just laugh at the situation, until Apollo asks Mercury if he would wear the chains if it meant he got a chance to sleep with Venus, to which Mercury replies that even if there were 3 times as many chains, he still would, which causes all of the gods to laugh once more, all except for Neptune, who was bargaining with Vulcan, telling them that if he let them go, he'd make sure Mars paid for the damages of Vulcan's cuckoldry, and everything would go back to normal. But Vulcan doesn't trust Mars to pay his debts, so Neptune promised him that he personally would pay for them if Mars didn't. So after that, Vulcan released everyone from their chains, and everyone was friends again. Ulysses was again impressed. To further drill his point home, Alcinous had Laodamas and Helios dance alone before them, as they were the most talented dancers on Scheria. So they do their dance, and Ulysses loves it, which leads him to compliment the Phaeacians again. Alcinous is happy to hear that Ulysses admires his people, so he orders them to give him some gifts, specifically requesting Euryalus to apologize. Euryalus gave him his own bronze sword, which had a silver hilt, as well as a sheath to go with it. Ulysses accepted the apology, and he said he hoped Euryalus wouldn't miss his sword. He was then bathed by the servants, and they wash him up with oil, and they give him a clean cloak. Remember that when you hear the words servant or maid, they're essentially a euphemism for slave. He then saw Nausicaa standing by a column, who playfully reminded Ulysses that he still owed her his life for saving him from the elements. He assured her that he would remember her and bless her for saving his life, and then he took a seat by the king. Food was almost ready, so they brought in Demodocus once more. Ulysses tore off a fatty piece of pork and gave it to his servant, telling him to give it to Demodocus. Ulysses explained that bards are honored, respected people, and that even though his songs brought him sorrow, Ulysses appreciated him. He said to the bard, "Hey, you're a really great bard. You speak as though you personally saw your stories unfold, or heard them from a first-hand account. Would you tell the story of the wooden horse at Troy?" And so Demodocus told of the great wooden horse, brought into Troy as the Trojans debated what to do with it. A few of them wanted to break it into pieces where it stood, while others wanted to throw it onto the rocks beneath the fortress, and some others were in favor of keeping it as an offering to the gods. And that's of course what they decided to do. And so the Achaeans emerged and sacked the city, with Ulysses and Menelaus fighting with great intensity toward the house of Deiphobus, and with the help of Minerva, Ulysses would be victorious. Hearing this, Ulysses, quote,
"Wept as a woman weeps when she throws herself on the body of her husband who has fallen before his own city and people, fighting bravely in defense of his home and children. She screams aloud and flings her arms about him as he lies gasping for breath and dying, but her enemies beat her from behind about the back and shoulders, and carry her off into slavery, to a life of labor and sorrow, and the beauty fades from her cheeks. Even so piteously did Ulysses weep, but none of those present perceived his tears except Alcinous, who was sitting near him, and could hear the sobs and sighs that he was heaving."
So Alcinous tells Demodocus to stop singing on account of their guest, and he asks Ulysses to tell him plainly who he actually was. The king recounted a prophecy from his father, that Neptune was upset with the Phaeacians for not being discerning enough on who they guided out to sea, and that one day their whole city would be buried beneath a mountain, though Alcinous wasn't certain whether Neptune would actually do this. Thus, the king asked Ulysses where he'd been on his journeys, what people he'd seen, and why he was so upset to hear Demodocus sing about Troy. So Ulysses is like, where do I even start? So much bad stuff has happened to me. But he starts by saying that his name is Ulysses, son of Laertes, and that the Phaeacians could come and visit his island Ithaca if they wanted. He recounted how, disembarking from Troy, he and his men set sail with a dozen ships to Ismarus, where all the Cicones lived. These people were allied with the Trojans in the war, so Ulysses took the opportunity to raid their settlement. They killed a bunch of the men and enslaved some of the women, but Ulysses' troops insisted that they stay and rest there for a while. The next day, many more angry Cicones arrived, who killed many of his soldiers, chasing them all the way back to their boats. Everyone was sad that some of their friends had been killed, but Jove didn't give them any time to recuperate. A big hurricane suddenly showed up, so the men had to take down their sails and row manually. After 2 days, they decided to bring up the sails again, but the north wind blew them off course to the island of Cythera. So 10 more days pass, and they reach the land of the lotus eaters. These guys just sit around eating lotuses all day, and they don't do much else. Ulysses sent some of his men further inland to investigate the people of the island, and when they reached these guys, they gave them some of their lotuses. So Ulysses' men didn't come back to him, but instead they just sat around eating these delicious lotuses, because that's the magical property of the lotus. It makes you forget about all your other desires in life, and you just want to keep eating the lotuses. But Ulysses came and dragged them away, and they cried as he did so. Seeing the danger in this situation, our hero thought that it would be best to just leave. And so they set sail away from the lotus eaters, towards the Isles of the Cyclopes. Off these isles, there was a nice little spot that had a lot of wild goats. Because Cyclopes don't know how to build boats, this little island was never colonized by them, and it was a safe place for Ulysses and his men to rest for a moment. They landed in the night and hunted some of the goats. As they were eating some of the meat, they saw the smoke of fires on a nearby island, and they thought they could almost hear the sounds of the Cyclopes talking, or of the sheep bleating. Ulysses is curious to see whether these people are friendly, so he invites his men to go visit this nearby island. They land, and Ulysses gets together some supplies so that he might be able to bargain with the Cyclopes if they were inhospitable. He gets together his 12 best men, and sets off. The men reached the big cave of the Cyclops, and snooped around at his wares. He had a lot of cheese, lots of milk, and huge flocks of sheep, but the men were envious of all this cheese, and they begged Ulysses to steal some. And as he's telling this story, he acknowledges that if they'd just stolen some cheese and then left, in hindsight that would have been a lot better than staying to meet Polyphemus. But they stayed to meet the Cyclops, and while they waited, they ate some of his cheese. So the Cyclops arrives, and he throws a huge piece of firewood onto the floor, which makes such a loud sound that Ulysses' men scurry to the end of the cave. The Cyclops drove in all of his sheep, and then sealed the exterior of the cave with an enormous rock that all of Ulysses' men wouldn't be able to lift. So the Cyclops takes to curdling milk when he lights his fire and all of a sudden sees the men. He says to them,
"Strangers, who are you? Where do you sail from? Are you traders, or do you sail the sea as rovers, with your hands against every man, and every man's hand against you?"
They were all scared by his booming voice and unnatural proportions, but Ulysses explained that they were just some Achaeans looking to find their way home, but through treacherous weather, they'd gone off course. He politely asked for some accommodations for him and his men. After all, Jove takes all respectable travelers under his protection. The Cyclops wasn't interested in this.
"Stranger, you are a fool, or else you know nothing of this country. Talk to me indeed about fearing the gods or shunning their anger. We Cyclopes do not care about Jove or any of your blessed gods, for we are ever so much stronger than they. I shall not spare either yourself or your companions out of any regard for Jove, unless I am in the humor for doing so. And now tell me where you made your shop fast when you came on shore. Was it round the point, or is she lying straight off the land?"
Now this was a bad development. But Ulysses was tricky, so he told the Cyclops that their ship had actually been torn apart by the rocks, and these men were the last survivors of his crew. The Cyclops didn't answer, and instead picked up 2 of his men and slammed their heads upon the floor, spewing blood and brain matter everywhere. The Cyclops then ate them limb from limb, in this messy, uncivilized fashion. The Achaeans were despondent, crying and praying to heaven. The Cyclops then went to sleep among his sheep. Ulysses wanted to sneak up on him and kill him with a precise strike, but he remembered that they'd have no way to move the massive stone guarding the door. He and his men had a miserable night, crying until morning came. Come morning, the Cyclops awoke and milked some of his sheep. He then killed and ate 2 more of Ulysses' men, and moved to the big stone door to leave, but he didn't forget to put it back to keep the prisoners from escaping. With the Cyclops gone, Ulysses took to finding a way out of this predicament. So the Cyclops had this huge piece of olive wood, which Ulysses cut 6 feet off of. He had his men sharpen it at one end, and place the tip in the fire so that it would harden. With their weapon ready, they hid it underneath some of the sheep poop in the cave, and waited for the Cyclops to return. The plan was for Ulysses and 4 other men to pick up this huge stake and stab it through his eye while he was asleep. So the Cyclops returns, and he does the same routine. He milks his sheep and kills 2 more of Ulysses' men. All of a sudden, Ulysses came up to the Cyclops with a bowl of wine, and he says that since he's been eating so much man flesh, he'll probably be thirsty, and that this was an offering so that he might let his men go. The Cyclops drank the wine, and it was some really good wine, so he asked for some more, and for what Ulysses' name was. Ulysses refilled the bowl 3 times, and said that his name was No Man. The Cyclops then responded,
"Then I will eat all Noman's comrades before Noman himself, and will keep Noman for the last. This is the present that I will make him."
But the monstrous giant was so drunk, he fell upon his back and went to sleep instantly. In his drunkenness, he vomited a bunch of wine and flesh everywhere, and while this was happening, Ulysses brought the wooden stake into the fire again to heat it up. He roused his men, and the 5 of them drove the beam into the Cyclops' eye as far as they could. They turned it round and round until the heat of the stake caused the blood to boil over and steam to rise from his enormous punctured eyeball. The Cyclops screamed terribly as he got up, leading Ulysses' men to run away. He threw the stake from his eye in a terrible rage. Now the other Cyclopes on the island heard this commotion, so they gathered around the outside of his cave and asked him what the problem was. The Cyclops yelled,
"No man is killing me by fraud. No man is killing me by force."
So the other Cyclopes hear this and decide to leave him alone. Ulysses, feeling very smug, watched as the Cyclops groped for his huge door, which he opened, causing the sheep to start leaving. The Cyclops felt at these sheep to try and see if his captives were escaping among them, but this was not Ulysses' plan. He devised for his men to cling to the underside of the sheep next morning to keep him from detecting them. So the next morning came, and the 6 of his men successfully escaped the cave by clinging to the bellies of the sheep, all except Ulysses, who was clinging to a ram, which the Cyclops personally inspected. He spoke to the ram, telling it about how much he resents No Man and his men, and how he wishes to kill them, but he didn't notice Ulysses hiding under the animal. So he and his men got together once they were away from the Cyclops, and met up with the rest of his people back at the boat. They were happy to see Ulysses back with his guys, but they cried from grief to hear about their fallen countrymen. Ulysses told them to be quiet, and set out to sea. Once they were a little ways away from the island, Ulysses, in all his wisdom, called out to the monster.
"Cyclops, you should have taken better measure of your man before eating up his comrades in your cave. You wretch, you eat up your visitors in your own house? You might have known that your sin would find you out, and now Jove and the other gods have punished you."
This made the Cyclops very angry. He threw a huge piece of mountain toward the front of the ship. This created a big wave and carried the ship back towards the island, but they were able to manually row away with great effort. Once they were twice as far as they were before, Ulysses began to taunt the Cyclops again, although his men begged him to shut up. But Ulysses, unfortunately, did not listen to them, and ridiculed the Cyclops once more.
"Cyclops, if anyone asks you who it was that put your eye out and spoiled your beauty, say it was the valiant warrior Ulysses, son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca."
Hearing this, the Cyclops suddenly remembered a prophecy he had heard from Telemus, son of Eurymus, who said that the Cyclops would one day lose his eye to someone by the name of Ulysses. And to really drive the point home, Ulysses finishes by saying,
"I wish I could be as sure of killing you outright and sending you down to the house of Hades as I am that it will take more than Neptune to cure that eye of yours."
And so the Cyclops prayed to Neptune, his father, that Ulysses would be killed on his journey home, or at least that all his men would die and he'd be really miserable. He threw one more rock at the ship, the recoil of which propelled them further away from the island. At last they returned to that island of goats, and they feasted upon some of the Cyclops' sheep. And again, they set off towards home, grieving the deaths of their friends. So they head over to the island of Aeolia, where Aeolus, the son of Hippotas, lives comfortably with his family. Ulysses stayed in his house for a month, and they talked about Troy a lot. Since Aeolus had been given control over the winds by Jove, he gave Ulysses a magical bag of winds that could be used to propel a boat in whatever direction you need. So they sailed for another 9 days, and then they could finally see Ithaca on the horizon. They were so close to being through with all their troubles. But Ulysses fell asleep, and his men speculated that the bag of winds was actually full of gold or silver, and in their greed and envy, they opened up the sack. The wind all flew out at once and created a huge storm, carrying them far out to sea. Having seen all this, Ulysses considers throwing himself into the ocean, but decides to keep on going. They were blown all the way back to the Aeolian island, where Ulysses met up with Aeolus and explained what happened. But Aeolus saw this as heaven's judgment, and he wanted nothing to do with anyone in bad standing with the gods, so he was through giving any help to Ulysses. They set sail and rowed for 7 days, when eventually they landed on the home of the Laestrygonians, the city of Telephus. Ulysses sent a few men to explore the island, and these guys met a young woman who was the daughter of the Laestrygonian Antiphates. She brought them to her father's house, and they discovered that her mother was an enormous giant. She called for her husband Antiphates, who quickly arrived and ate one of Ulysses' men. So the other two started running back to the boats, but Antiphates calls to the other Laestrygonians to kill these guys. So these giant ogres start to cover the whole island, throwing rocks at the men. Some of the men on the beach get killed by rocks or speared, so Ulysses had to leave as fast as he possibly could. Only one of their 12 ships survived the Laestrygonians. They do manage to get away, and they come upon their next island, Aiaia. They rest in the harbor of that island for a couple days, composing themselves from the traumatic experience. But come the third day, Ulysses began to explore the island in search of human habitation. Climbing high, he spotted smoke from the house of a powerful nymph, Circe, which can also be pronounced Kirke. I think that's the way they do it in the Greek, but here I'll be calling her Circe. Ulysses decided it would be best to investigate this with some of his men backing him up, so he heads back to the boat. He kills a stag along the way, and he shares the meat with the boys. The next day, Ulysses told everyone about the smoke he saw, and they're a bit disappointed because the encounter with the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians was still fresh on their minds. They cried, but Ulysses divided them into two groups, one led by Eurylochus and one led by himself. So Eurylochus' group finds Circe's house, patrolled by wolves and lions tamed by her magic. They weren't aggressive, but instead greeted the men affectionately. This only served to scare them. As they reached the gate of the house, they could hear the beautiful singing of Circe at her loom, prompting one of the men to comment, "There's someone in here singing and spinning a loom. Let's see if it's a goddess or a mortal woman." They call for Circe, and she greets them and welcomes the men inside. Everybody except for Eurylochus enters her house, because Eurylochus is thinking that she might be up to something. With the rest of the men, she sat them down and gave them a meal of cheese, honey, and wine, but it was secretly drugged with something that would make all the men forget about their homes. After they ate the bait, Circe waved her wand and turned them all into pigs, and put them into her sties. Eurylochus waited outside, and the men never returned, so he ran all the way back to Ulysses. He was so distraught that he wasn't able to articulate himself, except through crying, but he eventually regained his composure and told everyone what happened. Ulysses grabbed his sword and his bow and told Eurylochus to guide the way, but he was too much of a coward, so Ulysses set off by himself. As he was approaching her house, Mercury appeared to him disguised as a young man. He explained to Ulysses that his men were turned into pigs, and he gave him a special herb that would ward off Circe's magic. Mercury goes on to say that she would try to drug him with her food, but that the power of the herb would protect Ulysses from any ill effects. And when Circe breaks out her wand, Ulysses would have to pull out his sword as if he were going to kill her, where then she would offer him to go to bed with her, but Ulysses has to say no. This is where he can make her turn his men back into men, and have her swear by the gods that she's done with her trickery. Mercury returned to Olympus, and Ulysses entered Circe's house. She gave him a silver seat to sit upon, and a golden goblet full of her drugged potion. He drank it, and there was no effect. She then tried to use her wand on him, but it didn't do anything. Ulysses pulled out his sword and held it above Circe, at which she fell to his knees and asked who he was, and why the drug didn't harm him. She actually deduced on her own that he had to be none other than Ulysses, who Mercury told her was on his way. So she invites him to go to bed with her, but Ulysses fears that she'll cut his penis off. He has Circe swear that she will not harm him, after which they have sex. Her servants bathe him and they gave him some good food and drink, but still suspicious, he didn't eat or drink anything. Ulysses explained that he wouldn't take anything she offered him until his friends were turned back into men. So she brought out the pigs from their sties and gave them a different magical herb, and before long, they were all back, except now they were a little taller and more handsome than before. Seeing Ulysses, the men cried tears of joy, which made Circe feel bad. She told Ulysses to go hide his ship and supplies in a nearby cave, and to return to her house with all of his men. And so Ulysses went back to the shore and met up with his men, who were very happy to see him. He told them that everything was okay, and that they were going to be feasting in Circe's home. But Eurylochus says,
"Alas, poor wretches that we are, what will become of us? Rush not on your ruin by going to the house of Circe, who will turn us all into pigs, or wolves, or lions, and we shall have to keep guard over her house. Remember how the Cyclops treated us when our comrades went inside his cave, and Ulysses with them. It was all through his sheer folly that those men lost their lives."
He had a point. This upset Ulysses so much that he considered beheading Eurylochus then and there, but one of the men suggested that Eurylochus could just stay with the ship, and with that, they set out. Although Eurylochus actually decided to go with the rest of them anyway. When Ulysses and the rest of his men arrived back at Circe's house, they cried tears of joy at seeing each other, until Circe asked Ulysses if he could tell them all to stop crying and dwelling on their past misfortunes so much. But she makes it clear that they could stay at her house for as long as they needed, to recuperate and recover for what lies ahead. And so Ulysses and his men stayed at Circe's house for a whole year, until they finally asked Ulysses if now might be a good time to get going, since he still needs to return to Ithaca. Later that night, while Ulysses was in bed with Circe, he told her that his men were growing tired of staying here and that they desired to get on their way back home. Circe made sure he knew that he could leave at any time, but that before he set off to Ithaca, he first had to visit the house of Hades in Proserpine so that he may see the spirit of the prophet Tiresias. Ulysses really didn't want to hear this, so he began to cry and throw a fit. When he was done, he asked Circe how he could find the House of Hades, and she explained that he wouldn't need any kind of a guide. All he had to do was raise a sail and the north wind would take him there, to Proserpine, to where the Perithikathon River and the Cocytus River, itself a branch of the river Styx, flew into the Acheron River. He had to look for a rock where these rivers met, and dig down, make a sacrifice and a prayer, and then meet several ghosts. Then Tiresias would tell Ulysses exactly how he needed to sail to reach Ithaca. They spoke until daybreak, when Ulysses came and woke everyone up and told them that it was time for them to get going. There was this man named Elpenor, who was drunk and lying on top of Circe's house. He heard a bunch of commotion coming from inside, so he leapt up and he fell to the ground where he broke his neck, dying instantly. So Ulysses says to everyone, "Sorry guys, but we aren't going home just yet. I need to visit the House of Hades first." They were pretty upset and they started crying again, but they did set off once more. Circe sent them a wind that got them on their way until they reached the river and brought the ships ashore. Ulysses came to spot the rock, where he had Perimedes and Eurylochus hold a sacrificial sheep and ox as he started digging out a trench. Ulysses brought an offering of honey, milk, wine, water, and barley upon the ground, and he prayed to the spirits, telling them that upon his return to Ithaca, he would sacrifice a cow for them. When he was finished praying, he cut the throats of the animals and saw the blood run through the trench. All at once, ghosts began to rise from the ground, from the underworld. All a different manner of people rose, and they began to utter a strange scream which made Ulysses turn pale with fear. He told his men to quickly flay the animals and make burnt offerings to the spirits. As Ulysses sat with his sword drawn, keeping the ghosts away from the sacrifice until he'd heard what he needed from Tiresias. Elpenor, the guy who just broke his neck, was the first ghost to address Ulysses. Ulysses felt very bad for him, and he cried when he saw him.
Elpenor, how did you come down here into this gloom and darkness? You have got here on foot quicker than I have with my ship.
The apparition replied that through his own misfortune and drunken vice, his soul had come down to the House of Hades. He asked Ulysses to burn his body and carry out an appropriate burial ritual, which he easily agreed to do. After this conversation, the ghost of Ulysses' mother, Anticlea, came upon him. When Ulysses first set off for Troy, she was alive, so this was the first he'd heard of her passing. He cried to see her dead, confined to this gloomy place. It was then that Tiresias arrived, who asked Ulysses to let him drink some of the blood upon the floor, and answer why Ulysses, a mortal, came to visit this place. Tiresias drank the blood, and at once he knew why Ulysses came here. He then proceeded to give him advice on how he might return home, with the lives of all of his men, even with the anger of Neptune working against him. Ulysses, coming upon the Thrinacian island, would have to avoid slaying the cattle of Hyperion. If they could just avoid eating these animals, everything would be fine and they would reach Ithaca. But if they slew and ate the animals, a terrible fate would befall all of his men. Tiresias said that Ulysses, in this hypothetical scenario, could still survive himself, but he would only return home in another man's ship, with all of his men dead, whereupon he would discover men eating up his estate and trying to court his wife. He said that he would kill all of these suitors, and the prophet then goes on to instruct Ulysses that he would have to venture through the land holding a wooden oar, where eventually he would meet a people who never went out to sea, where he would have to sacrifice a ram, a bull, and a boar to Neptune, and when that was done, he'd have to sacrifice 100 oxen to collectively honor all of the gods. He says that Ulysses will one day die amidst the sea, when he is old and content, and he will be remembered well by all his people. Ulysses accepts this, but he asks the prophet if he could see the ghost of his mother once again, who did not remember him or speak to him. The prophet explained to him that if he let any ghost drink the sacrificial blood, then they would speak to him as anyone normally would, and so his mother returned and he let her drink the blood. Anticlea asked him why he had come to this dark place as a mortal, and if he had managed to return to Ithaca yet. Ulysses told her that he hadn't returned home due to a long series of misfortunes, but he wanted to know how his father was, how his house was doing, how Penelope was doing, how Telemachus was doing, and, of course, how his mother had died. Anticlea told him that Penelope had not yet remarried, but spent all day and night crying. Telemachus managed Ulysses' house, and his father Laertes lived in the country, where he also was in grief over the loss of his son. This was what killed his mother. Anticlea grieved Ulysses' disappearance so much that it was the death of her. Hearing this, Ulysses tried to embrace and console his mother, but her immaterial form made her phase right through him. She advised her son to return to the mortal world as soon as he could. With that, she departed. Many more famous ghosts came upon Ulysses, whose coming and going he narrated to the Phaeacians. Everyone back in Scheria was thoroughly enthralled by his exciting tale. Queen Arete then said to them, "Wow, this guy's great, but let's not be in a hurry to get rid of him." Achilles then said that what Arete had just said was pretty much the truth, but that it was Alcinous' opinion which held all the authority. But Alcinous agreed that this Ulysses guy was great, and that they'd provide him with whatever means he needed to get home. He compared Ulysses to a bard, and he specifically asked him if he could remember seeing any of the ghosts of the heroes at Troy while he was in the House of Hades. So Ulysses resumes his narration. Agamemnon's spirit drank the blood of the ox and at once recognized Ulysses. The two men cried when they saw each other, until Ulysses asked him about the manner of his death. Again, Agamemnon's story was told, how he came to his death at the hands of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra. On how Aegisthus killed him, Agamemnon recalled,
"He asked me to his house, feasted me, and then butchered me most miserably, as though I were a fat beast in a slaughterhouse, while all around me my comrades were slain like sheep or pigs for the wedding breakfast, or picnic, or gorgeous banquet of some great nobleman. You must have seen numbers killed either in a general engagement or in single combat, but you never saw anything so truly pitiable as the way in which we fell in that cloister, with the mixing bowl and the loaded tables lying all about, and the ground reeking with our blood. I heard Priam's daughter Cassandra scream as Clytemnestra killed her, close beside me."
He goes on to say that the enormity of Clytemnestra's betrayal slandered the name of all the women of the world, even the good ones. Ulysses said that the women of the house of Atreus really were the worst. Between Clytemnestra and Helen was the whole reason for the war in the first place. Agamemnon warned Ulysses not to be too trustful of women, even of his own wife Penelope. But what he's most concerned about is the well-being of his son Orestes, so he asks Ulysses if he knows how he's doing. And then Ulysses basically says, "How would I be able to know that?" The two talked some more, when the ghosts of Achilles, Patroclus, Antilochus, and Ajax the Great came upon them. Achilles was wondering what he was doing all the way down here, so Ulysses told him that he needed help on his way back to Ithaca, and that even though Achilles was dead, he could rest assured knowing how beloved he was among the Argives. To which Achilles said,
"In death's favor, I would rather be a paid servant in a poor man's house and be above ground than king of kings among the dead."
Achilles really just wanted to know what his son Neoptolemus and his father Peleus were up to. Ulysses didn't know anything about Peleus, but he told Achilles that his son Neoptolemus was wise in strategy and a brave fighter who killed many men at Troy. When they were all on the wooden horse, Neoptolemus was the only one who wasn't afraid to leave it and start fighting, and he went on to survive the war without any injuries. Achilles is really happy to hear this, and he departs from Ulysses feeling great. Next was Ajax, who was still upset over Ulysses receiving Achilles' magical armor instead of himself. Ulysses pleaded to Ajax for forgiveness, but he stubbornly refused to answer. Ulysses then saw Minos with his golden scepter, Orion with his great bronze club, Tityus with his liver being eaten by 2 vultures, Tantalus, who stood in a lake, unbearably thirsty, but whenever he would bring water to his lips, it would disappear as a punishment from the gods. He saw Sisyphus rolling his boulder to the top of the hill, only for it to roll down just before he reached the top, forever and ever. He saw the ghost of Hercules, who asked Ulysses if he too was suffering above ground, just as Hercules had in life, but he left without hearing Ulysses' answer. Many thousands of ghosts began to swirl around Ulysses, making ghastly cries out to him, and he thought that Proserpine might send up a Gorgon to deal with him. This thought, along with all the ghosts, left him feeling so frightened that he had to leave at once. He ran back to his ship and swiftly departed with all of his men, where the wind took up their sails and drifted them back toward the Aeaean island. They landed back on the island and slept through the night. In the morning, Ulysses sent some men to go get Elpenor's body so that they could perform the funeral rites. They burned the body and bury him, placing the oar he'd row with as a grave marker. Then Circe came to Ulysses and praised him for being brave enough to visit the house of Hades. She said that when he died, it would be like he'd died twice, since he already visited the underworld as a mortal. They ate all day long, and as night fell, Ulysses' men slept in his ship while Circe kept talking to him. Ulysses told her all about the strange and terrible things he'd seen on his journey. Circe then began to give him some advice on what to do when he inevitably came upon the sirens. All around these sirens are the bones of men who were enchanted by their song and drawn into their death. So he and his men would have to make sure that they stuffed their ears with wax before they could hear the singing. After getting past them, Ulysses would have to choose between 2 really bad options. There's this nasty rocky strait he has to go through. The only guy who ever got through the strait without losing any men was Jason, with all his Argonauts. One path has this very dangerous monster known as Scylla. According to Circe, even a god would be terrified of her. She's got 12 misshapen feet and 6 long necks, each with a head that has 3 rows of teeth. She's known to attack ships and fly off with a man for each head. The alternative path has this huge fish monster Charybdis, who creates giant whirlpools which destroy entire ships. She tells him that it would be best if he choose the route of Scylla, because he'd be better off losing 6 men than his entire crew. Ulysses was looking for a way he could ward these things off without losing any of his men, but Circe tells him to just accept that he was up against immortal beings, and he should just try and take the least amount of losses he can muster. So after going past those 2, Ulysses would have to pass the cattle and sheep on the island of Thrinacia, and all they'd have to do is just not touch them. If they did touch them, the whole ship would be lost and all the crew killed, like the dead prophet said. But all they have to do is just leave the livestock alone, so this should be the easiest part to get through. The first light of day was showing, so Ulysses said goodbye to Circe, and she returned to her comfy house. The men set off from sea, all rowing their oars, as Circe sent a wind to fill their sails. Ulysses then felt like he shouldn't be the only one who knew what was going to happen, so he explained Circe's warning about the sirens to his men. Then all of a sudden, the wind cut out and everything was dead silent. They knew they'd come upon the sirens, so everybody put some wax in their ears. Except for Ulysses, who was tied to the mast of the ship, because he wanted to be able to hear the sirens sing. They sang to him.
Come here, renowned Ulysses, honor to the Achaean name and listen to our two voices. No one ever sailed past us without staying to hear the enchanting sweetness of our song, and he who listens will go on his way not only charmed, but easier. For we know all the ills that the gods laid upon the Argives and Trojans before Troy, and can tell you everything that is going to happen over the whole world.
Ulysses liked what he was hearing, so he tried to indicate that he wanted to be released by frowning to his crew, but this only made them row faster. They made it past the sirens, when they saw huge waves spraying in the distance, with a loud roaring sound. There was a little panic, and everybody stopped rowing. But Ulysses reminded them that the situation they were in then wasn't nearly as bad as back when they were held by the Cyclops, and it was his wisdom that got them out of that mess. His men grew braver and started rowing again, although Ulysses didn't tell them about Scylla, because he knew they wouldn't be willing to go through with this if he did. So they enter the vast rocky strait, and they see Charybdis sucking up water out in the distance. She would vomit out huge amounts of water, spraying all the way over the tops of the rocks, and then begin to suck again, creating a vast whirlpool. His men were scared by this, but things got significantly worse when Scylla grabbed Ulysses' 6 best men and flew off with him. They called out Ulysses' name as they were taken off to their doom. She threw them upon the rocks and bit off their flesh, while the Achaeans screamed terribly. Ulysses clarified that this was actually the worst thing he saw on his long voyage. But they did pass through the strait, and that was when they reached Thrinacia, and they heard Hyperion's sheep bleating. Here, Ulysses explicitly told his men that this was actually the most dangerous obstacle yet, and that everyone had to steer clear of this island. They were very unhappy to hear this. Our good friend Eurylochus was his fiercest critic, complaining about how Ulysses never seemed to suffer or get worn out, while his men were all very tired and wished to sleep on the island. After all, night was coming, which is when the wind is most dangerous. The whole crew was on Eurylochus' side. Ulysses was disappointed, but he gave in to their request, making them all swear that they wouldn't touch any of the animals on the island. That night, the men talked about their friends who were killed by Scylla, which makes them all cry themselves to sleep. The next day, Ulysses reminded them that they actually had plenty of meat and drink on board the ship, so they didn't need to kill any of Hyperion's animals. But days passed, and the wind kept blowing to the south and to the east, which would put them off course if they started sailing, so gradually the food supply dwindled, and the men had to resort to eating birds. One night, while Ulysses was a little ways away, Eurylochus tried to convince the men to kill some of the flock. He argued that they were starving, and that starving has to be the worst way to die, that they would sacrifice the animals, and that this would stave off the fury of the gods, that when they got back to Ithaca, they'd build a temple to Hyperion, and he'd forgive them. And in the hypothetical scenario that he didn't, it would be better to be outright killed than starve to death. So they killed and ate some cows. On his way back, Ulysses could smell the meat cooking, and he prayed to the gods that his men didn't kill the cows they were specifically not supposed to kill. Seeing this, Hyperion's daughter, Lampedia, told her father that Ulysses' men were killing his cows. He was extremely angry at hearing this, because he loves his cows. He threatened to visit Hades and abandon the living altogether, but Jove told him that he'd just even the score by striking their ship with a thunderbolt. Ulysses later knew this had transpired because he heard it from Calypso, who in turn had heard it from Mercury. And so Ulysses discovers his men with the meat, and he personally reprimanded every individual member of his crew. That's when the cowhides started to crawl around as if they were alive, and all the meat started mooing. This was a bad sign. They stuck around for another 6 days eating those cows, when the wind finally started to get back on track. They set out to sea, and once they were a little ways away from Thrinacia, Jove summoned a black cloud over their ship, the sea growing dark beneath it. An enormous wind rattled the vessel, breaking off the mast. It fell upon a man, breaking his skull and forcing his body overboard. Then Jove threw down one of his thunderbolts upon the ship, and every one of Ulysses' crew fell out into the ocean and perished. But Ulysses was able to hold on to the broken mast, and was carried off by the wind. It blew south at first, bringing him all the way back to the rocky strait of Scylla and Charybdis. Charybdis was sucking up a big whirlpool again, which caught Ulysses in its current. He escaped by clinging to a fig tree, which he held tightly onto until eventually the whirlpool shot his mast back out, and he grabbed hold of it, rowing with his hands until the wind picked up once more. For 10 long days, Ulysses was out at sea when he came upon the Aegean island. There he met Calypso, and so ends Ulysses' tale to the Phaeacians. King Alcinous reassures Ulysses that there wouldn't be any more trouble in him getting home, and that they'd send him back with a bunch of gold. So later that day, they had another big feast, and Demodocus came out and sang again, and everyone loved it, except for Ulysses, who was starting to really want to be on his way again. Night came, and Ulysses said, "Alright, thanks for everything, guys, but I'm gonna be headed out to the ship now." So Alcinous had a guy show him to his ship, and some servants over there set out a little rug and a sheet for Ulysses to sleep on. They began to row out into the ocean, while Ulysses was comfortably lying in his little bed. They steadily drove through the sea all night, and when morning came, they reached a small Ithacan harbor where they placed Ulysses' sleeping body, and hid all of his golden gifts beneath an olive tree to protect them from any thieves. Meanwhile, Neptune was still upset with Ulysses, so he said to Jove, "Hey, I understand we decided to let Ulysses get home, but letting him get home with this luxurious escort and all these gifts is ridiculous." Jove said that he could basically do whatever he wanted to the Phaeacians if they were treating him disrespectfully. So Neptune went to Scheria, and just as their ship was returning, he turned it into stone and it sank into the sea. This astonished all of the Phaeacians who saw it, until Alcinous brought up the prophecy. Neptune, upset with the Phaeacians giving generous escorts to just anyone, would sooner or later sink a Phaeacian vessel. So Alcinous tells everyone that they won't be giving anybody any more escorts, and to quickly sacrifice 12 bulls to Neptune. They did so, and as they were praying around an altar of Neptune, Ulysses would wake up, finally back on Ithaca. At first he had no idea where he was, and with all this gold and nowhere to store it, he wished he had just stayed over with the Phaeacians. This was in part because it was really misty out and he didn't recognize the island. He felt a little resentment toward the Phaeacians, thinking that they'd abandoned him in the middle of nowhere. He paced up and down the beach, when Minerva appeared to him as a shepherd. Ulysses greeted her as the first person he knew of this land, and asked her what this place was and who lived here. Minerva told him that he's either stupid, or he just arrived from a far-off land, because everybody knows the name of this island. It's none other than Ithaca. Ulysses was happy to hear that. He goes on to tell Minerva this long story about how he's actually from Crete, where he killed the guy who tried to steal from him, which ultimately led to him being dumped on this island by some treacherous Phoenicians. Minerva smiled and caressed his face, which he suddenly took the form of a woman, and praised his ability to lie and sneak his way out of any situation, even once he's finally back in his home country. She explained that she was Jove's daughter, Minerva, who watched over Ulysses on his long journey home. The goddess told him that trouble had come to his house, and that for the time being, he couldn't tell anyone his name. Ulysses thanked Minerva for helping the Achaeans fight at Troy, but he said that he didn't see any of her help between his leaving Troy and her appearing to him on Scheria. He suspected some kind of trick, so he again asked Minerva whether or not he was really in his home country. She commented that Ulysses was always this careful and cunning, which was the reason why she'd taken a liking to him. She explained that she didn't help him during so many pivotal moments of his return journey because she didn't want to sow any anger with her uncle Neptune, but right now, he just had to get home. She cleared away the mist, and Ulysses was overjoyed to recognize his homeland, and he kissed the ground once more. Minerva and Ulysses hid all of the golden loot in a nearby cave, and when they were done they sat down beneath an olive tree and spoke about what to do with the suitors. So Minerva explains everything that had been going on with the malicious suitors abusing his estate, and Ulysses thinks, I would have ended up just like Agamemnon if I hadn't heard all this from the goddess. So he asks her for help on the day that he slays the suitors, saying that with her on his side, he would be able to fight 300 men. Minerva reassures him that she'll be there when the time comes, but that first he'll have to disguise himself as an ugly old beggar and meet up with his slave, Eumaeus, while Minerva goes and gets Telemachus back from Sparta. Here, Ulysses realizes something. Why didn't Minerva just tell Telemachus exactly where his father was the whole time? After all, she knew exactly where Ulysses was. Nothing was keeping her from just telling Telemachus. She says that she set Telemachus on his journey to enhance his reputation among the Ithacans while he was gone. She then told him that the suitors were also waiting to try and ambush him at sea to kill him, but that it wasn't really anything to be concerned about because he'd probably be fine. Then she touched Ulysses with her wand, and he magically transformed into a really wrinkly old man, wearing a raggedy tunic. With this, Minerva left to go and get Telemachus back from Sparta. Ulysses went on his way until he found Eumaeus' hut, where he was tending to his pigs. A bunch of angry dogs came upon him, but Eumaeus quickly shooed them away and welcomed the stranger into his hut. Ulysses was very grateful to be welcomed in, and he thoroughly thanked Eumaeus, who reassured him that all beggars and strangers are sent directly from Jove. Eumaeus bemoaned the fact that his master Telemachus was as young as he was, being only 20 years old. He missed his old master, Ulysses, who would have given him a hut, some land, and a wife, and he goes on to say that he resented Helen, as this whole mess originated with her. The swineherd then went on to sacrifice and cook 2 young pigs, and sang as he prepared the meal. He brought the meat to Ulysses, and the two of them talked some more. Eumaeus told them that they were only eating servants' pork, and that the succulent fat pigs would go to the suitors. He elaborated some more about how the suitors were always eating Ulysses' flocks, and Ulysses didn't say anything, as he quietly listened and thought about revenge. Eumaeus also told them that a lot of people would show up to exploit Penelope's desire to hear about what happened to her husband, but In reality, they would just be lying vagrants looking for a place to stay. And Eumaeus personally thinks that by this point, Ulysses has to be dead. There's no way he could have been gone for this long and still survive, though Eumaeus still honors his memory. Ulysses is impressed, so he swears to Eumaeus that he actually knows Ulysses is going to be coming back this year, and when he returns, he will deliver severe punishment to those harassing his wife and son. But Eumaeus didn't believe him, and so he tried to change the subject from this topic. He asked Ulysses who he was, and why he came to visit Ithaca. Ulysses said to him that he could talk for 12 months of his long misfortunes without finishing, and he got to speaking. He said that he was from Crete, that he was the son of a wealthy man and a concubine he'd purchased. When his father died and his estate was divided up among his sons, he received very little, but he was able to marry into another wealthy family. He fought on 9 expeditions, commanded many men, and grew very rich over the years. When the Trojan War came, he fought for 10 years, and eventually sacked Troy. After he came back home, he was only there for a month, when he decided to go on another expedition, this time into Egypt. When they arrived, the plan was to scout out this place in advance, but his soldiers lacked discipline, so they slew whatever men they found, and abducted their wives and children. Once this started happening, enemy soldiers sprang out from everywhere, and his men ran away in panic, so a ton of his guys were killed or enslaved. Seeing this, he dropped his shield and spear, took off his helmet, and kissed the knees of the king, who took him into his palace. So then he lived with the Egyptians for 7 years. Then this Phoenician guy convinced him to go with him to Phoenicia, where he stayed for 12 months, when he then sent him on a ship toward Libya. He suspected that he might have been sold as a slave without being told, but as the boat was sailing, Jove destroyed it with his thunderbolts, and everyone died. Except for him. He clung to a severed mast until he drifted to the island of the Thesprotians, who told him that Ulysses was sailing home with a whole lot of gold. Then the king of the Thesprotians kindly sent him off with a ship of his own, but the crew decided that they'd be better off if they just sold this guy into slavery. They reached Ithaca, and they gave him some tattered clothes and tied him up on the boat, but the gods untied his rope, so he was able to escape. After wandering through the island, he eventually reached Eumaeus' house. And then Eumaeus was saying, "Okay, that's very interesting, but you're mistaken about Ulysses. He's not coming back." He recalled other men who had prophesied of Ulysses' return, and how they were all mistaken. So Ulysses offers a bet. If Ulysses does, in fact, return, then he'd have to receive a cloak and a good shirt, and a ship to Dulichium. But if he was wrong, then he'd have Eumaeus tell his men to throw him off a cliff, to warn people about telling lies. And Eumaeus replies by saying, "What kind of person would I be if I just killed you after taking you in as my guest? But the food is almost ready, so let's just focus on that." Eumaeus sacrificed and cooked a decent quality 5-year-old pig, and he shared it with his guests and his servants, making sure to leave aside some for the gods. Ulysses is once again very grateful to receive this delicious pork, and he praises Eumaeus for his generosity, upon which Eumaeus tells him to just eat his food. Night came, and it was a pretty nasty night. It was storming and very cold out. Ulysses was curious to see whether Eumaeus would ask one of his men to give him a coat, or whether Eumaeus would give up his own coat. So Ulysses starts to tell a fictional story from back at Troy. Still in his bigger persona, he asked Ulysses for a coat on a cold night, so Ulysses told one of his men to go and get some more men. Since they were a long ways away from their ships, they took off their coat before running all the way back, which Ulysses then gave to him. He then asked Eumaeus for a coat, to which he obliged, letting Ulysses borrow a very heavy cloak they had for the worst weather. Everyone slept pretty well that night, and Ulysses was happy to see Eumaeus looking after his place so well. Meanwhile, Minerva found Telemachus in Sparta sleeping at Menelaus' house, alongside Pisistratus. Minerva came to Telemachus and said that he shouldn't leave his mother alone to deal with all these suitors by herself, and that he should return home fast. She then told him that the suitors were waiting in the strait between Ithaca and Samos, intending to kill him, so he should avoid getting too close to those islands. And when he does get back to Ithaca, Telemachus should go and check out his friendly swineherd Eumaeus. After saying all this, Minerva heads back to Olympus. Telemachus wakes up Pisistratus and tells him that they have to go get their chariot ready and go home right away, but Pisistratus told him that you can't just drive a chariot around in the dark, and it would be rude not to accept Menelaus' parting gifts and say goodbye to him in the morning. Morning comes, and they greet Menelaus, and Telemachus tells him that he'd like to get on his way back home. They had a quick meal, and Telemachus received some nice gifts, and so he and Pisistratus climbed into their chariot and set off back to Pylos. Menelaus says goodbye to the both of them, telling them to tell Nestor how hospitably he received them, and Telemachus said that, yes, they'd definitely tell Nestor about everything, and that he also had a strange feeling that when he returned to Ithaca, Ulysses would be waiting for them. The moment he said this, an eagle with a goose in its claws flew overhead. Everyone was astonished, and then Pisistratus asked Menelaus who he thought this omen was for, but Helen answered him.
The eagle came from the mountain where it was bred and has its nest. And in like manner Ulysses, after having traveled far and suffered much, he will return to take his revenge, if indeed he is not back already and hatching mischief for the suitors.
Telemachus hopes that's the case, and he said that if it proved true, he would honor Helen by making vows to her. Without another word, the chariot shot off, the two of them traveling all day. At night, they slept at VIII, where the people were kind to them. The next day they rode until they reached Pylos, when Telemachus asked Pisistratus if he'd please just leave him by his ship, because even though Nestor is a kind person, he just really had to get back to Ithaca. Pisistratus agreed, and he left Telemachus by the ship, which was full of Pylians waiting to take him back. Then a prophet approached him, who was currently a fugitive from Argos for killing somebody. This dude was called Theoclymenus, and he asked Telemachus where he lived and who his parents were. So Telemachus told him that his dad was Ulysses and he lived in Ithaca, and that he was looking for word of his absent father. Theoclymenus said that he was also in exile from his homeland, for the crime of murder, and that he's being pursued by these men from Argos. Telemachus agrees to take him on board, and they all set off from the shore toward Ithaca. The boat was eventually blown toward the islands the suitors hid in earlier, and Telemachus wondered if he might be killed or taken as a prisoner. While all of this was happening, Eumaeus and Ulysses were eating in the hut again. Ulysses tested his host's kindness one more time, and he asked him to guide him to the city so that he could beg for food over there. He'd see if any of the suitors would be willing to give him anything, and if he might be able to become their servant. Eumaeus was really dismayed to hear this, because he knew the suitors would have way higher standards for servants than this ragged beggar, and the fact that he wasn't any huge burden for Eumaeus to deal with himself. So Eumaeus told him that he could stay until Telemachus returned, and that when he was back he'd give Ulysses a shirt and cloak and send him wherever he wanted to go. Ulysses was grateful as always, and he took this opportunity to ask about the fate of his mother and how his father was doing. Laertes was evidently still very upset about Ulysses' absence and the death of his wife, while Anticlea, of course, was dead from grief. Eumaeus told him that she'd raised him as if he were one of her own children, as he'd been brought over to Ithaca when he was a young boy. This prompts Ulysses to ask him how exactly he arrived at Ithaca. Eumaeus was originally from an island called Syra, where his father reigned over 2 cities. One day, some Phoenicians showed up, and they seduced a woman from his father's house who was, coincidentally, also a Phoenician. They managed to convince her to leave with the rest of them, so that she could see the house of her parents, who were still alive. At the time, she was nursing the king's infant son, and she brought him with them so that they could sell the boy into slavery for an easy profit. About a year passes, in which the Phoenicians load up their ship with goods, and they sneakily disembark from Syra. On the 7th day of sailing, the woman died, and her body was thrown overboard, and poor little Eumaeus was all alone. The ship then reached Ithaca, where he was purchased by Laertes. Ulysses, upon hearing all this, feels the need to point out that Eumaeus doesn't have it all that bad. After all, he had a kind master and a generally comfortable life, whereas this bigger persona Ulysses was putting on had to dress in rags and go about begging. Meanwhile, Telemachus was starting to reach Ithaca. He told his men to bring his ship inward, and that he personally would be going to visit his pig keeper. Then Theoclymenus was thinking, hang on a second, what's going to happen to me? And Telemachus told him that, under the usual circumstances, he would kindly receive the prophet and be very hospitable toward him, but now really wasn't a great time. But he did tell him that he could go and visit his mother's most persistent suitor, Eurymachus, if he really wanted. He goes on to speculate whether a bad fate might befall Eurymachus before he manages to marry Penelope, when a hawk flew overhead, a dove in its talons. Theoclymenus told him that this sight had to be the doing of a god, that Telemachus' house would remain the most powerful in Ithaca. And Telemachus just thinks, yeah, I hope that's right. He said he'd give the prophet some gifts if it turned out to be true. The prince then told his friend Piraeus that he could take this guy into his house, and he agreed. After this, he put on his sandals, grabbed a spear from the boat, and strode as fast as he could toward Eumaeus' house. Meanwhile, Eumaeus and Ulysses were eating breakfast when Ulysses heard footsteps outside, which didn't cause any of the dogs to bark. So he told Eumaeus, and all of a sudden Telemachus was at the door of the hut. Eumaeus jumped up, dropping bowls of wine as he embraced Telemachus, kissing him. So Eumaeus said that he was glad to see him, that it wasn't very often that Telemachus would visit these people out in the country, to which Telemachus told him that he just wanted to visit him and also check up on his mom. And Eumaeus told him that Penelope was still as sad as ever. Telemachus entered the hut, and Ulysses got up to offer him his seat, but Telemachus had Eumaeus bring him another one instead. The three of them eat some food, until Telemachus asked Eumaeus where this random guy they were eating with came from. Eumaeus explained that he was a Cretan, escaping from some Thesprotians, and that Eumaeus was going to make him Telemachus' responsibility. But Telemachus didn't really want to hear this, since he was so young, and he already had his hands full with the suitors, but he still offered to give Ulysses some clothes and a sword, and send him wherever he wanted to go. Ulysses told him that he was upset to hear about these suitors, and he asked him if he had any brothers to help him, or if the other Ithacans responded to this shabby treatment. Ulysses said,
I wish I were as young as you are and in my present mind. If I were son to Ulysses, or indeed Ulysses himself, I would rather someone came and cut my head off, but I would go to the house and be the bane of every one of these men. If they were too many for me, I being single-handed, I would rather die fighting in my own house than see such disgraceful sights day after day, strangers grossly maltreated, and men dragging the women servants about the house in an unseemly way, wine drawn recklessly, and bread wasted all to no purpose for an end that shall never be accomplished.
Telemachus told him that, alas, he was the only child of Ulysses and he had no brothers. All the other men of Ithaca weren't much help either. He then told Eumaeus to go tell Penelope that he was back, and she didn't need to worry about him anymore. But the servant was told specifically not to tell anyone else, not even Laertes, because with him they just have one of Penelope's servants go out and tell him. With that, Eumaeus was off, and at that moment Minerva materialized outside the hut in the form of a woman. Upon seeing her, all of the dogs ran away whining. She stood in the entryway and was invisible to Telemachus, but visible to Ulysses. She beckoned him outside, where she told him that now would probably be a good time to reveal to Telemachus that his father had come back. She touched him with her wand, making him young and powerful again, and fixing up his clothes. And thus, Minerva left. Seeing Ulysses return to the hut, Telemachus was afraid, because he thought that he might be in the presence of a god. He asked him if he was one, and said that he would make many sacrifices to him if he was. And Ulysses said,
I am no god. Why should you take me for one? I am your father, on whose account you grieve and suffer so much at the hands of lawless men.
He kissed Telemachus, and a tear fell from his cheek. Telemachus thought that this wasn't actually Ulysses, but rather some god messing with him, as no mortal could change their appearance like that. And Ulysses told him that he had no need to be skeptical, that it was really him after these 20 long years, and that his physical transformation was at the hand of the goddess Minerva. Then Telemachus embraced his father.
They were both so much moved that they cried aloud like eagles or vultures with crooked talons that have been robbed of their half-fledged young by peasants.
Eventually, Telemachus asked by what ship Ulysses reached this place, and Ulysses said that he'd taken a Phaeacian ship and left them a lot of gold which they hid back in that cave. But he didn't tell the whole story because he was mainly concerned with doing away with the suitors right now. Ulysses asked his son for a list of all the suitors, so that he'd be able to determine whether they together would be able to kill them, or if they'd have to try and find help somewhere else. Telemachus told him that there were 52 suitors from Dulichium, 24 from Sami, 20 from Zacynthus, and 12 from Ithaca, for a grand total of 108. With numbers like these, the odds weren't in their favor, but Ulysses had faith in Minerva and Jove. This reassured Telemachus a little. So the plan was for Telemachus to head down to Ulysses' estate, and live with the suitors as he'd been doing earlier. Then Ulysses, again disguised as the beggar, would be brought to the estate by Eumaeus. And he told Telemachus that, even if they were really cruel to him in this form, he'd have to keep himself from intervening. And eventually he'd nod to Telemachus, as a special signal for him to go and retrieve all the armor and the weapons with which they'd killed the suitors. And importantly, Telemachus couldn't tell anyone that Ulysses was back, not even his mother. Telemachus respected his father's guidance, but he was a little skeptical of this plan because of how long it would take, though he was willing to go along with it for now. As this was happening, the ship that Telemachus came in on had a servant arrive to tell Penelope that her son returned, and coincidentally, this guy arrived at the exact same time as Eumaeus. They both gave their message, which the suitors managed to get a hold of. Outside the house, they gathered round. Eurymachus spoke up first, saying that they had to quickly get a ship together to go and bring back the rest of the suitors. Just as he said this, Amphinomus noticed the ship with all the suitors in the harbor, which made him laugh. He told the others that the suitors on the ship must have had some kind of divine intervention, or they simply weren't able to catch Telemachus. So they go down and meet up with these guys, and then all of them are back together at the assembly place. Antinous brought up the fact that it was a little disturbing that, apparently, the gods intervened to save Telemachus. He argued that, with the general feeling of Ithaca being against the suitors, they had to kill Telemachus before he's able to call everyone to a formal assembly, because there he'd be able to tell everyone how the suitors tried to kill him. And they'd have to make sure that there weren't any witnesses either. He suggested for them to ambush him on his farm away from town, or while he was on the road. Now compared to all the other suitors, this Amphinomus guy wasn't that bad. He said that, maybe killing Telemachus is actually a pretty bad idea. He is of noble blood after all. So he says that they'll look to the gods for advice on what to do, and if the gods say to kill him, then Amphinomus himself will be the one to do it. Everyone thought that this seemed pretty reasonable, and they went to sit down inside Ulysses' house. There, Penelope left her room and told Antinous that he was a real prick for conspiring to have her son killed. She laid out some serious insults to him and reminded him of what Ulysses had done for his family. A long while ago, Antinous' father came to Ithaca for shelter from some Thesprotians, because his father helped some Taphian pirates plunder their land. It was Ulysses who personally intervened to save his life, and Antinous was going to repay this favor by trying to kill Ulysses' only son? And so she told him to leave Telemachus alone, and keep the other suitors away from him too. Eurymachus tried his best to brush all this off, telling her that none of them would harm Telemachus, and that Telemachus was actually a great friend of theirs, that they all had nothing but respect for Ulysses. And of course, this was all a lie, and they still very much planned to kill him. Penelope headed back up to her room and cried herself to sleep again. That evening, Eumaeus returned to his cottage. Shortly before he entered, Minerva showed up and turned Ulysses back into an old beggar so that Eumaeus wouldn't see him and go around telling people anything. Telemachus asked the swineherd what the talk of the town was, and Eumaeus said that he didn't really stick around to chat with people, but that he saw what he thought was the suitor's ship near the shore. When Telemachus heard this, he smiled to Ulysses, but in a way so that Eumaeus wouldn't see it. The three of them eat and drink together, and then they fell asleep.
What the dog doing?
Next morning, Telemachus told Eumaeus that he was going to say hi to Penelope, and that Eumaeus would be responsible for guiding the beggar into the city. Then Telemachus went into town and reached his house, where he found Euryclea putting fleeces onto some chairs. She cried when she saw him, and so did many of the other maids. When Penelope came to see him, she cried as well. After a brief exchange with his mother, Telemachus talks a little with Piraeus, Theoclymenus, Mentor, Antiphus, and Halitherses, who caught him up to speed on what he missed while he was gone. Then Piraeus asked him if he'd have some maids come over to move all of Menelaus' gifts to his house for safekeeping, to which Telemachus told him that if the suitors did manage to kill him, he could keep the gifts for himself, but that he'd have them brought directly to him if he managed to win. Telemachus and Theoclymenus have a meal together, and then Penelope asked her son whether he had heard anything about Ulysses while he was out. Telemachus said that Nestor didn't have any news about him, but when he saw Menelaus, he told him that he'd heard Ulysses was stuck on Calypso's island and wanted to get home, but was being held captive by the nymph. Theoclymenus said that Telemachus didn't really understand what he was talking about, and that Ulysses was actually back in Ithaca already, learning about what the suitors were up to. And Penelope said, "Yeah, I hope that's true. If it is, I'll make sure you receive some gifts." Meanwhile, the suitors were having fun throwing discs in front of Ulysses' house, when the servant Medon brought them inside for dinner. As this happened, Eumaeus reached the outside of town with Ulysses, where he gave him a handy walking stick to help him get around. They walked into the city and came across Melanthius, one of Ulysses' old goat herders. He severely insulted the both of them.
"Where, pray, master swineherd, are you taking this poor, miserable object? It would make anyone sick to see such a creature at table. A fellow like this never won a prize for anything in his life, but will go about rubbing his shoulder against every man's doorpost and begging, not for swords and cauldrons like a man, but only for a few scraps not worth begging for."
This made Ulysses very angry. To make matters worse, Melanthius kicked him for no reason, although his kick failed to move Ulysses at all. He thought about killing the man, but he refrained from letting his emotions take control of him. At this, Eumaeus prayed to the heavens that Ulysses might return to Ithaca to end this sort of behavior, but Melanthius only responded,
"You ill-conditioned cur, what are you talking about? Someday or other I will put you on board ship and take you to a foreign country where I can sell you and pocket the money you will fetch. I wish I were as sure that Apollo would strike Telemachus dead this very day, or that the suitors would kill him, as I am that Ulysses will never come home again."
After saying all that, he got on his way into Ulysses' house. Being Eurymachus' favorite goat herder, he sat with him and all the other suitors. Eumaeus and Ulysses were approaching the outside of the house, as Eumaeus warned him that the suitors might throw something at him. Ulysses reassured him that after everything he'd been through, he could stand having something thrown at him. As they talked, they were spotted by Ulysses' old dog, Argos. He used to be a great hunting dog, but in the time since, he became neglected. He laid in a pile of cow and mule manure, his body infested with fleas. Upon seeing Ulysses, the dog was able to recognize him, making him one of the only ones who could see through Minerva's disguise. Argos dropped his ears and wagged his tail, but didn't move over to his old master. Ulysses wiped a tear from his eyes as he said to Eumaeus,
"Eumaeus, what a noble hound that is over yonder on the manure heap. His build is splendid. Is he as fine a fellow as he looks? Or is he only one of those dogs that come begging about a table and are kept merely for show?"
Eumaeus said to him,
"This hound belonged to him who has died in a far country. If he were what he was when Ulysses left for Troy, he would soon show you what he could do. There was not a wild beast in the forest that could get away from him when he was once on its tracks. But now he has fallen on evil times, for his master is dead and gone, and the women take no care of him. Servants never do their work when their master's hand is no longer over them, for Jove takes half the goodness out of a man when he makes a slave of him.
As the two left to meet with Telemachus and the suitors, Argus died. Telemachus saw Eumaeus and signaled for him to come sit with him, so he did. Ulysses then entered the house, leaning on his walking stick. Telemachus gave Eumaeus a loaf of bread and some meat to give to this man, and he told him to tell him to go around begging to all the different suitors for food. Eumaeus relayed the gift and the command, and as a bard sang a tune, Ulysses devoured the meal. When he was done, Minerva also told him to go around asking the different suitors for food, so that they would be able to tell who the nice and the mean suitors were, although she still intended for all of them to be killed. And thus, Ulysses went around all the men asking for food. Some of them were generous and gave him some food, while others just wondered where this guy came from. Melanthius said that he saw him earlier, led into town by Eumaeus. Hearing this, Antinous insults Eumaeus for bringing this poor beggar to bother them. Eumaeus defends himself and complains that Antinous is always the worst to Ulysses' servants, especially towards him, but that he'd bear it so long as Telemachus and Penelope were around. Telemachus told the swineherd to ignore him, and then commanded Antinous to give the beggar something of his own, to which Antinous responds,
"What do you mean, Telemachus, by this swaggering talk? If all the suitors were to give him as much as I will, he would not come here again for another 3 months."
With this, he picked up a stool and acted like he was about to throw it at Ulysses, but he stayed his hand as the beggar went about each suitor receiving some piece of food. When he reached Antinous, he asked him for something, as he appeared to be a rich man. But Antinous rebuked him once more, to which our hero criticized him for being so stingy with food that didn't even belong to him, as they were in Ulysses' estate. Now Antinous was really pissed off.
"You shall pay for this before you get clear of the court."
He threw the stool, hitting Ulysses' back right shoulder. The blow didn't make him budge at all, and he only shook his head in disapproval. The beggar returned to his spot by the door, and said to the suitors that he prayed Antinous might soon perish, making the suitor yell at him more.
"If you say more, I will have you dragged hand and foot through the courts, and the servants shall flay you alive."
By this point, the other suitors were tired of his behavior, and one reminded him that the gods were capable of changing their appearance at will, that if this beggar was a god in disguise, Antinous would be in for a bad time. Telemachus was upset seeing all of this, silently shaking his head as he thought about his revenge. Word of what Antinous did got around to Penelope, and she fantasized of his death at the hands of Apollo. A nurse reaffirmed her, to which Penelope replied,
"Nurse, I hate every single one of them, for they mean nothing but mischief. But I hate Antinous like the darkness of death itself."
She then told Eumaeus to go bring this mysterious beggar to see her, as she had some questions for him. Eumaeus put in a good word for him, talking about how great of a storyteller he was, and that he heard Ulysses was among the Thesprotians. So Penelope told him to bring the stranger to her again, and she reiterated just how badly the suitors were behaving and how great it would be for Ulysses to return and kill a lot of them with the help of Telemachus. Just as she finished saying this, Telemachus sneezed loud enough for everyone in the house to hear it. This made her laugh, and she took it as a sign that the suitors would indeed be killed soon. Eumaeus went up to Ulysses, who said that he was afraid to pass through all the suitors to get to Penelope, and that they should wait until that night to talk. The swineherd relayed this to Penelope. He then spoke to Telemachus, telling the man that he was going back to his pigs and wishing him luck against the suitors. So Eumaeus set off, as the suitors began to sing and dance as usual. But there was another beggar in Ithaca, who was known for being a glutton and a drunkard. His real name was Arneus, but everyone just called him Iris, as they used him to run their errands, and Iris was the errand runner of the gods. He came upon the house, and then threatened Ulysses. He said that all of the suitors wanted him to be removed, and that he'd beat him up if he didn't comply. Ulysses tried to smooth things over, and let Iris know that he'd win any fight between the two, which only made the man angrier. He insulted Ulysses, and warned him that he would never be able to beat someone so much younger than himself, as the two prepared to fight. Seeing this, Antinous laughed, and called all the other suitors to watch these two destitute men battle it out. They gather around the two of them, and Antinous tells them that the victor will have his fill of goat's meat and be able to sit with the suitors, and that they wouldn't allow any other beggars to come around the palace. Ulysses just asked everyone not to intervene to help Iris win the fight, which they all promised not to. He tied his rags around his hips, revealing his muscular body. Although it was already magnificent, Minerva intervened to make it slightly more so. The suitors were shocked, and spoke to one another about what a pickle Iris would find himself in. This made Iris nervous, and he started shaking. Antinous reprimanded him for being afraid of fighting an old man, saying that if he lost the fight, he'd ship him off to King Echetus, who would cut off his nose, ears, and disembowel him. This only made Iris more nervous. The time came for the two to fight, with Ulysses deciding that he wasn't going to go all out on this guy, to keep the suitors from suspecting who he really was. Iris hit Ulysses' right shoulder, which Ulysses quickly responded to by punching Iris' neck. The punch broke some of his skull bones, and blood poured from his mouth. The beggar fell to the ground, kicking and moaning from the pain. This amused the suitors greatly, with all of them laughing at once. Ulysses dragged Iris outside the house and set him upright, giving him his staff back. He advised the man not to try and one-up himself over the other beggars anymore, and then Ulysses headed back to his house. When he met the suitors again, they were laughing and they told him that they'd take Iris to King Echetus, who'd kill him. So Antinous gave Ulysses some goat meat, and Amphinomus gave him 2 loaves of bread. The suitor wished him good luck, and to come across better fortune in the future. Ulysses said to him, "Amphinomus, you seem to be a pretty decent person. After all, your father, King Nisus of Dulichium, is a good person. But you have to remember, man is a vain creature who doesn't always see danger where it is. Look what these suitors are doing to this guy's house, to his wife. When he comes back, which will probably be very soon, it's gonna be bad." And he says to him, "Amphinomus, I hope you aren't there when he gets back." But it was already over for him, as Minerva willed for Amphinomus to be killed by Telemachus. The goddess then gave Penelope the idea to come downstairs and see everybody, but before she did, Minerva made her fall asleep, in which she made her taller and gave her a more commanding presence. She went downstairs with some of her maids, wearing a veil before her face. Penelope criticized her son for allowing a stranger to be as mistreated as Ulysses was, to which he replied that there was only one of him and so many suitors, but that it would be great if Apollo broke the necks of every one of these guys, but alas. Eurymachus went up to Penelope, and he said,
"Queen Penelope, daughter of Icarius, if all the Achaeans and Iasian Argos could see you at this moment, you would have still more suitors in your house by tomorrow morning, for you are the most admirable woman in the whole world, both as regards personal, beauty, and strength of understanding."
But Penelope said that her beauty left her when Ulysses set off for Troy, and as he left, he told her that when Telemachus began to grow a beard, enough time would have passed for her to remarry. And so she would eventually have to marry one of these suitors, even though the custom was for the suitors to bring up their own sheep and cattle as gifts to the woman they court, instead of eating up their property as the suitors had been. She put some emphasis on this last fact. Ulysses heard all this, and being as cunning as he was proud to hear Penelope trying to haggle some gifts out of these suitors, and he knew that she wouldn't actually marry one of them. Antinous spoke up, saying that she could receive whatever presents she wanted from the suitors, just that they weren't going to leave her alone until she caved in and married one of them. All the suitors clap, as each one sends a servant to go and fetch a present for her. Antinous' servants brought a fancy dress, Eurymachus brought a chain embroidered with amber beads, Eurydamas' 2 servants brought some nice earrings, and Pisander brought her a beautiful necklace. Penelope returned to her chambers, her maids carrying all these expensive offerings. The suitors then started singing and dancing until dark, when some maids lit torches so that everyone could still see. Ulysses went to speak to them, telling them that he'd be willing to hold one of the torches so that a maid could go comfort Penelope instead. He was insulted by Melantho, the sister of Melanthius. She was a maid who was in love with Eurymachus, and she told Ulysses to go away, that he wasn't worthy of speaking to them, that he let his victory with Iris go to his head, and he should leave this place before someone came around and beat him up. Ulysses responded to this by threatening to go tell Telemachus what she said, that he would have her torn limb from limb. This frightened them, so they all scurried into the house, leaving Ulysses to hold one of the torches outside. And Minerva wanted to make sure that Ulysses really hated these suitors, so she made Eurymachus make fun of him. After he specifically insulted his laboring skills, Ulysses turned to him and started to list off how superior he was to Eurymachus at every trade. He was a better harvester, a better plower, a better fighter. Ulysses finished with this remark.
"You are insolent and cruel, and think yourself a great man because you live in a little world, and that a bad one. If Ulysses comes to his own again, the doors of his house are wide, but you will find them narrow when you try to fly through them."
Enraged, Eurymachus gave a less eloquent attack.
"You wretch! I will soon pay you out for daring to say such things to me, and in public too. Has the wine been getting into your head, or do you always babble this way? You seem to have lost your wits because you beat the tramp Iris."
He then threw another stool at Ulysses, but he quickly hid behind Amphinomus. The stool missed and hit a random servant caught in the crossfire. He cried out as he fell to the ground, dropping his wine jug. Now, the other suitors were starting to get kind of tired of this beggar, and started to really perceive this guy as a problem. Telemachus came out and reprimanded the suitors for behaving so badly, and like a disappointed parent, he sent them off to bed. Amphinomus, ever the agreeable one, apologized on their behalf. They all had a drink and went home.
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier.
Ulysses stood in the courtyard, thinking about how he was going to kill the suitors. He told Telemachus to go and get some armor together for them, and that if the suitors saw him taking it, to just tell them it was being taken away to get it out of the smoke, and so that the suitors wouldn't see it and think about using it to fight each other. Telemachus called for Euryclea to seal the maids away, as he was about to move the armor, and she said she would, but she also asked why the stranger in the courtyard would be able to move the armor with him and not the maids, to which Telemachus explained that the stranger had to do a little manual labor first to be rewarded with food later. So Euryclea locked the maids into their rooms, as Ulysses and Telemachus put all the armor and weapons they could find into the house. As they did so, Minerva illuminated the way for them so that they could see better. When they were done moving everything, Telemachus went to sleep, while Ulysses stayed inside to talk with Penelope as they'd planned. When Melantho saw Ulysses again, she insulted him for sticking around and threatened to chase him away with a piece of burning wood. He asked her if he made her so angry just because he was poor, and he said that he used to be rich, but he had just fallen on bad times. He also mentioned that Ulysses might be back soon, and that Telemachus was growing up and wouldn't just let this kind of behavior slide anymore. Penelope overheard this conversation and chastised Melantho for behaving so poorly toward their guest. The two of them sit down, with Penelope asking Ulysses where he was from and who his parents were. The beggar flattered her, but requested that she wouldn't ask about his past, because it would just make him sad. Penelope received the compliments with humility, and proceeded to explain her situation with her missing husband and all the suitors occupying the house, and how they're growing increasingly impatient. Once more, she asks Ulysses where he's from, to which he replies that he was a Cretan, the son of Deucalion, that his name was XVIII. He said that he saw Ulysses in Crete while he was on his way back from Troy, and that he took him into his house as a friendly host would. He told her that Ulysses and his men stayed with him for 13 days, until the wind became more favorable and they sailed away. Penelope cried hearing this, quote,
"As the snow wastes upon the mountain tops when the winds from southeast and west have breathed upon it and thawed it till the rivers run bank full with water, even so did her cheeks overflow with tears for the husband who was all the time sitting by her side. Ulysses felt for her and was sorry for her, but he kept his eyes as hard as horn or iron without letting them so much as quiver, so cunningly did he restrain his tears."
To determine whether all this really happened, Penelope asked the beggar how Ulysses was dressed and who he was with. Ulysses described his cloak and his clothes in great detail, and recounted how he had the servant Eurybates with him. Since this was solid evidence that the stranger had met Ulysses, Penelope wept once more, and said that it was she who gave Ulysses those clothes. She mourned how she thought that she would never see her husband again, regretting how he set off for Troy. She resents it so much, she can't even bring herself to say the city's name. Ulysses encouraged her to cheer up, and said that he heard that Ulysses was still alive, with the Phaeacians, and he was coming back to Ithaca by the end of the month. He elaborated that Ulysses would have been home sooner, had he not been wise enough to go around gathering treasure to bring back home. Speaking about himself in the third person, he made it clear just how much he admired himself. And Penelope wishes that this was the case, but she still doesn't believe him. She orders her maids to wash his feet and set up a bed for him, but Ulysses refuses to sleep with any blankets or to have his feet washed, unless it was by a maid who was old and had gone through as much hardship as he had. Penelope liked to see this kind of humility, so she called over Euryclea to wash his feet. The queen commented that Ulysses' hands and feet must have been similarly old and wrinkly as this stranger's, 20 years having passed. Hearing Ulysses' name, Euryclea cried at how much she missed her old master, at how pious he was at dealing with the gods, yet how they seemed to abandon him. The maid also commented on just how much this stranger resembled Ulysses, between his voice and his physical appearance, especially that of his feet. And Ulysses just commented, "Yes, many people have said that I look like Ulysses." With this, the maid took to washing his feet. Now, a long time ago, Ulysses' grandfather, Autolycus, came to see his newborn grandson. With the infant resting on Euryclea's knees, she asked him what he was going to name the baby.
"Call the child thus. I am highly displeased with a large number of people in one place and another, both men and women, so name the child Ulysses, or the child of anger."
Some time passed, and when Ulysses was grown enough, he came to visit his grandfather at Mount Parnassus. Together with some of his relatives, they hunted through the forested slopes of the mountains, until the young Ulysses came upon an enormous boar. He stabbed the ferocious animal with a spear, hitting its right shoulder, but not before the boar ripped through his leg. Ulysses' strike did kill it, but he would be left with a noticeable scar on his leg for the rest of his life. Euryclea immediately recognized this scar, dropping his leg into the bowl of water, spilling it out everywhere. She was shocked to see the man alive, and overjoyed at his return. Minerva distracted Penelope from witnessing this scene, as Ulysses grabbed the maid by her throat and cautioned her not to tell anybody that he was back, and threatened to kill her if she did so. The nurse assured him that she wouldn't tell anybody, and said that she'd get him a list separating all of the good maids and all of the bad maids. And Ulysses told her that he didn't need to hear anything about this list because he trusted his own judgment more than hers, and that she should just focus on keeping quiet. Adjusting his rags to hide the scar, Ulysses went back to speaking with Penelope. She asked him to try and interpret a dream of hers that she'd been thinking about. She had 20 pet geese, which she really liked, and in this dream a big eagle came down and killed all of her geese. She cried to see all of her geese dead, and her maids all came out to see what was going on, and then the eagle spoke to her with a human voice.
"Be of good courage, daughter of Icarius.
This is no dream, but a vision of good omen that shall surely come to pass. The geese are the suitors, and I am no longer an eagle, but your own husband, who am come back to you, and who will bring these suitors to a disgraceful end.
The dream would end there, and after waking up, Penelope would look over to see that all of her geese were actually fine. Ulysses said that the dream simply foretold the death of the suitors. This was kind of obvious, and there wasn't much room for interpretation. But Penelope was still skeptical as to whether this would actually happen. She recounted how Ulysses used to set up 12 axes, and then shoot an arrow through all of them. A competition would be set up. The suitor who could achieve this task tomorrow would be the one she finally marries. Ulysses told her that she could hold her tournament if she wanted, because her husband would return that day before any of them were able to do it. The conversation ended there, and Penelope went back up to her room, where she cried for Ulysses until she fell asleep. That night, Ulysses was in the courtyard laying on a cattle hide, trying to sleep. He was thinking about how he would go about killing the suitors, when he saw a bunch of maids leaving the house, all giggling and laughing, on their way to the suitors' homes. This enraged him, and he thought about killing them all right there, but he opted against it. Ulysses reminded himself that what he was going through right now wasn't nearly as bad as when he had to deal with the Cyclops, and so he persevered. But he still couldn't sleep very well. He kept thinking about how he, alone, could possibly kill all the suitors at once. Then Minerva walked up to him and asked what was bothering him so much, as he was finally back in his own house with his wife and son nearby. He told the goddess that he was worried about how he'd have to fight so many men at once, and there would also be a ton of people who would be pissed off that the suitors were killed. Minerva reminded him how she helped him in the past, and then she cast him off to sleep. While Ulysses was still sleeping, Penelope awoke and started crying. When she was finished, she prayed for some escape, or for death, to save her from being forced to marry one of these suitors. Ulysses heard this weeping, and he prayed to Jove for a sign of some kind. Jove heard this prayer, and sent down the tremendous sound of thunder. A nearby miller servant heard this, and she stopped to pray that this sign indicated today would be the death of the suitors. She said this because she was tired of having to make so much bread for them. Ulysses overheard this prayer and felt reassured. Meanwhile, back inside, Telemachus asked Eurycleia if she made sure the stranger had a nice place to sleep, and she explained to him that he insisted on sleeping outside that night. He headed to the assembly place, as Eurycleia called all the maids to clean up the house and get a big feast ready. Eumaeus showed up with some pigs, and he asked Ulysses how the suitors were acting toward him, to which the hero said that they were as bad as ever. Then Melanthius showed up again, and he asked Ulysses what he was still doing here. After all, there were plenty of other places he could go about to beg. Ulysses didn't respond, only bowing his head in silence. There was this other guy, the herder Philotius, who was kind to the stranger, and said that he resembled his old master, Ulysses. He talked about how he resented these suitors, how he thought about taking the flock over to some other master, but wouldn't on account of Telemachus being around. Ulysses liked this Philotius guy, so he told him that before he left, Ulysses would be back, and he'd killed all the suitors. Philotius assured him that if this somehow happened, he'd be sure to help him do the deed. As this was going on, those dastardly suitors were again conspiring on some way to kill Telemachus, when abruptly an eagle flew overhead, with a dove in its claws. Amphinomus saw this omen, and said to everyone else that this plan they were hatching was going to turn out badly, so they should all just go and get some food instead. Before long, everyone was feasting again, but this time Telemachus made sure that Ulysses would have a little table all to himself. He then addressed the suitors, telling them that they would have to act respectfully toward the stranger, or else. Only Antinous protested this, but Telemachus ignored him. Everybody enjoyed the feast for a while, but Minerva wanted to make sure that Ulysses was absolutely furious with all of these people. So again, she stirred up some more trouble. She made Ctesippus, a rich man from Samni, throw a hoof at Ulysses, but Ulysses turned his head to dodge the attack, and gave a smug smile. Telemachus said to him that he was very fortunate Ulysses turned his head, because if the foot hit him, he would have speared Ctesippus then and there. He said that he was a man now, that he knew the proper way to behave.
I have long seen you killing my sheep and making free with my corn and wine. I have put up with this, for one man is no match for many, but do me no further violence. Still, if you wish to kill me, kill me.
One of the suitors, Agelaus, said that Telemachus made some reasonable points, and that they should leave him and the stranger alone. But he also said that he should tell his mother to hurry up and marry one of the suitors already, since Ulysses had been gone for so long, there was no way he was realistically going to return. And then Telemachus would be able to fully inherit his father's estate, and he could just relax. And Telemachus just told him that his father was probably dead, that he would let his mother marry whoever she wanted, but that he would never, ever force her into a marriage. Hearing this, the suitors all took to laughing wildly, laughing so hard that they all cried. This was Minerva's doing, and witnessing the scene, Theoclymenus said,
Unhappy men, what is it that ails you? There is a shroud of darkness drawn over you from head to foot. Your cheeks are wet with tears. The air is alive with wailing voices. The walls and roof beams drip blood. The gate of the cloisters and the court beyond them are full of ghosts trooping down into the night of hell. The sun is blotted out of heaven, and a blighting gloom is over all the land.
They all laughed more, Eurymachus telling his servants to throw the prophet out of the house, but Theoclymenus left of his own accord, telling the suitors that a terrible fate was in store for all of them. He went over to be with Piraeus, as the suitors kept on mocking him. One suggested to Telemachus that he sell Theoclymenus and this beggar into slavery to make a quick profit. Telemachus said nothing, and only looked over to Ulysses. He thought that this would be the moment he began to kill them all, but nothing happened. Up in her room, Penelope listened to what everyone was saying throughout the whole meal. Minerva gave Penelope the idea to set out the axes for the competition, so she brought out Ulysses' bow and quiver to the courtyard, and told the suitors that if any one of them could string the bow and shoot an arrow through these axes, she'd marry them. She told Eumaeus to set up the 12 axes, and he cried as he did so. Seeing Ulysses' bow, Philoetius also cried. Antinous rebuked them, as Telemachus said that he'd try and shoot the arrow to demonstrate how it's done, but he failed to string the bow 3 times in a row. On the 4th time, he actually would have been able to string it, but Ulysses made a signal to him not to do so. Leiades was the next one to try it. He acted as a priest among the suitors, and hated to see how poorly they were behaving. He too failed to string the bow, and so he turned to the other suitors, and said that this bow would take the life and soul out of many of them, to which Antinous became very frustrated. A bunch of the other suitors tried to string the bow, but none of them could do it, leaving Antinous and Eurymachus. Ulysses then snuck outside with Eumaeus and Philoetius, and he quietly asked them who they'd side with if Ulysses suddenly returned, and the both of them answered that they would certainly side with Ulysses, and they prayed for his return. Here he said to them,
"It is I, Ulysses, who am here. I have suffered much, but at last, in the 20th year, I am come back to my own country. I find that you two alone of all my servants are glad that I should do so, for I have not heard any of the others praying for my return."
He then told them that if they helped him win, he would make sure they found wives, had a house close to Ulysses, and would remain as close friends of his. To prove his identity, he showed them the scar on his leg. They both wept to see their master return, and the two embraced him. Ulysses then instructed Eumaeus to go and get the bow, because he knew that the suitors wouldn't let the beggar get a hold of it. The swineherd would also have to tell the women to close the doors of the house, and not to open them no matter what they heard was going on in the courtyard. Philoetius' job was to seal up the doors to the outer courtyard. When Ulysses returned to the court, Eurymachus was holding the bow, heating it up in a fire, but even with this handicap, he wasn't strong enough to string it. He was really disappointed by his failure, not just because he wouldn't wed Penelope, as he mentioned that there were plenty of other women on Ithaca. He was really ashamed because they all failed to be strong enough to string Ulysses' bow. Antinous reassures him that today was the feast of Apollo, who was a god of archery. Tomorrow they'd just hold a sacrifice to Apollo, and then they'd hold the competition a second time. Ulysses asked for the bow, and this instantly made the suitors worry whether he would actually be able to string it. Antinous tried his best to put the man down.
"Wretched creature, you have not so much as a grain of sense in your whole body. You ought to think yourself lucky in being allowed to dine unharmed among your betters, without having any smaller portion served you than we others have had, and in being allowed to hear our conversation."
He accused Ulysses of letting the wine get to his head, and threatened to send him to Echetus if he managed to string it. The suitor compared the beggar to the centaur Eurytion, who once got really drunk and misbehaved in the house of Perithoas, leading his hosts to cut off his ears and nose. This all brought about a war between the humans and the centaurs. But Penelope said that the beggar should be able to have a fair shot at the competition, and that she wouldn't, in practicality, marry him. And Eurymachus explained that they weren't so concerned about her marrying this stranger, as they were that he'd string the bow that none of them were able to string, and then word would get around through Ithaca that this lowly beggar was able to do what none of the suitors could manage. And Penelope simply responds that they were already acting terribly by eating all of Ulysses' animals, so they didn't have to worry about the beggar showing them up. It wasn't like public opinion of them could get any worse. She commanded them to give him the bow. Telemachus then stated that he was the only one on the island with the right to determine who could and could not use his father's bow, and he told his mother to head inside and attend to her own womanly duties. So Penelope went back inside and went to sleep, as Eumaeus took the bow into his own hands. All of the suitors protested, one of them saying that they were praying to the gods that his boars would kill him. This scared Eumaeus, so he put the bow down, but Telemachus quickly told him to pick it back up, threatening to throw rocks at him all the way back to his house. This made the suitors laugh, so Eumaeus picked up the bow and brought it to Ulysses. The swineherd then met up with Euryclea and told her that she'd have to seal all the maids in their rooms and not let them out regardless of what they heard happening outside, which she agreed to do. As this was happening, Philocteus sealed the outer gate with a thick rope. Ulysses examined the bow intently, which made the suitors wonder what exactly he was up to. With very little effort, Ulysses strung the bow as Jove sent down thunder. He grabbed an arrow, pulled back the string, and shot it through all 12 axes. He turned to his son.
It is time for the Achaeans to prepare supper while there is still daylight, and then otherwise to disport themselves with song and dance.
Saying this, Ulysses made a signal through his eyebrows, and Telemachus grasped his spear. Ulysses ripped away his rags as he jumped up, his bow in his hands and the quiver on his back.
The mighty contest is at an end. I will now see whether Apollo will vouchsafe me to hit another mark which no man has yet hit.
An arrow shot through Antinous' neck, just as he was about to sip wine from a golden goblet. Blood poured out everywhere as all the suitors began to panic. They threatened to kill him, but they only thought that this arrow hit Antinous by mistake. Ulysses revealed himself to the suitors, scaring all of them as they tried to find a way out. Eurymachus said that all their bad doings were just Antinous' idea, that he was the one who wanted to kill Telemachus, and now that he was dead, everyone could just get along. He offered for every suitor to pay Ulysses with 20 oxes to make up for everything. And to this, Ulysses just said that there was nothing they could do, and he was going to kill them all. Unable to bargain with the king, Eurymachus rallied the suitors as he pulled out his bronze sword and ran at Ulysses. Ulysses shot an arrow into his liver, and the man fell onto a table, spilling food everywhere. There, Amphinomus drew his sword and charged at Ulysses, but Telemachus managed to stab him from between his back, the blade piercing right through his chest. He left the spear impaled through the man, because he was afraid that if he took the time to try and wedge it out, a suitor might come up and kill him. So he quickly came to Ulysses to tell him that he was going to go and get some more weapons, as Ulysses held off all the men with his bow. Telemachus ran to the storeroom full of armor, and came back with shields, spears, and helmets, which the men armed themselves with. After this happened, Melanthius snuck out to that same room, and brought as many spears and pieces of armor as he could carry. Seeing all the suitors with this armor, Telemachus remembered that he forgot to lock the door to the armor room, so he sent Eumaeus out to investigate. There, he saw Melanthius trying to take some more of the equipment, and with the help of Ulysses, they tied Melanthius up and left him hanging painfully from the ceiling. As they got ready to fight again, Minerva appeared to them in the form of Mentor. Ulysses invited him to fight with them, although he knew this was actually the goddess in disguise. Agelaus saw them, and he said,
Mentor, do not let Ulysses beguile you into siding with him and fighting the suitors. This is what we will do. When we have killed these people, father and son, we will kill you too. You shall pay for it with your head, and when we have killed you, we will take all you have, indoors or out, and bring it into Hotchpot with Ulysses' property. We will not let your sons live in your house, nor your daughters, nor shall your widow continue to live in the city of Ithaca.
All this did was make Minerva angry, so she asked Ulysses why he hadn't been fighting these suitors with the same skill and tenacity with which he fought on Troy, and then she turned into a swallow and flew to the roofs to watch the battle. Agelaus encouraged the other suitors to keep fighting, as they all threw their spears at Ulysses and his men. Minerva had all of them miss their mark, as our heroes flung their own spears in return. The spears of Ulysses, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Philocteus each killed a suitor, with Philocteus' blade killing Pisander. Now all the other suitors started to retreat into a corner, as Ulysses and his men retrieved their spears from the dead. The suitors threw a second volley of spears, but these only managed to graze one of Telemachus' wrists, and cut into Eumaeus' shoulder. They thrust into the cornered mass of men, Ulysses killing Eurydamas, Telemachus killing Amphimedon, and Eumaeus killing Polybus. Philocteus then hit Ctesippus in his chest, and scoffed at him for how cruelly he treated his master in his own house. With that, Ulysses stabbed him. Leodes begged for mercy, and assured Ulysses that he always tried to stop the bad behavior of the other suitors, and that he was their priest. Ulysses just said that, if this was the case, he must have been praying that the king would never return, and that Penelope would marry him. Before Leodes was done talking, Ulysses cut his head off with Agelaus' sword. Phemius the singer was among the suitors, and he also begged for his life. Holding Ulysses' knees, he said that he would regret killing him, since he was such a great singer. And he also said that Telemachus could confirm that he was actually made to sing for the suitors against his will. Telemachus told his father to spare both the bard and the servant Medon, as these guys were alright. Medon, who was hiding under a cowskin, went up to Telemachus and hugged his knees, as Ulysses told the servant that nothing bad would happen to him. But the violence wasn't over yet. Ulysses examined the corpses for anyone playing dead, but he couldn't find anybody. He then had Telemachus go get Euryclea, who was overjoyed to see the gory sight, though Ulysses cautioned her against celebrating such a thing. He then asked for a list of all the women who slept with the suitors, even though he told her earlier that he wouldn't be needing this kind of help from her. Eurycleia explained that of the 50 maids in the house, a dozen had been sleeping with the suitors. She had all those women come to Ulysses in the courtyard, who instructed them, along with Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Philocteus, to clean up all the dead bodies and gore. Afterwards, the women were to be stabbed to death with swords. The maids all cried to see the suitors killed, but they moved the bodies outside, and all the blood was cleaned up. Before long, there was no evidence that the battle had taken place. Telemachus decided that the sword would be too honorable a death for these women, so he had them all hanged instead. To deal with Melanthius, they brought him out into the court where they cut off his nose, ears, hands, feet, and penis, throwing it to the dogs. I wonder how Nolan is going to go about adapting this part. Now that their revenge was finally complete, Ulysses burns a fire so that the whole property could be disinfected with its smoke. Eurycleia brought him some clean clothes, and she told the remaining 38 maids that the old master Ulysses was back. Holding torches, they all came out to greet him, kissing and embracing the returned king. Laughing, Eurycleia went upstairs to go tell Penelope that Ulysses was back. She told her to wake up, and said that he was back and that all the suitors were already slain. And Penelope says that her maid has to have been driven crazy by one of the gods, and that if Eurycleia were any other maid, she'd have a real scolding. But the nurse reiterated that Ulysses was actually back, that he was the true identity of the beggar. Penelope believed her this time, and hugged Eurycleia, crying tears of joy, and she asked the maid how he was able to kill so many people, to which she replied that she wasn't there, so she didn't know, until Ulysses summoned her and she saw him standing above all the dead bodies. All of a sudden, Penelope became skeptical again, thinking that this must have been the intervention of some god, and not her husband, who was long dead. Eurycleia said that she saw the old scar from the boar hunt, and that if Ulysses wasn't really back, she could have her killed if she wanted. And so Penelope went downstairs, and thought about whether it would be better to embrace the man, or be more cautious as to who he might be. She sat down with Ulysses, looking at him in silence. She didn't immediately recognize her husband. Telemachus asked his mother why she hadn't gone up to him and started asking him questions, and she said that she was at a loss for words, but that she had a way she could know for sure whether he was her husband. Ulysses smiled, and told Telemachus that she didn't recognize him because of how shabby his appearance was, but at the present moment, they had a serious problem on their hands. The families of Ithaca, who might try to avenge their sons. Telemachus said that, somehow, Ulysses would find a way to deal with this. And Ulysses agreed. The plan was to get everyone dressed up nice, and have Phemius go play a tune outside, so that if anyone walking by the house looked into it, they'd just think that a wedding was going on. Nobody would suspect the killings. And later, they'd all flee into the woods and sort out what to do. The maids cleaned some more, as Phemius sang and played his lyre. Everyone was singing and dancing, and some people passing by outside heard everything that was going on, and someone said,
"I suppose the queen has been getting married at last. She ought to be ashamed of herself for not continuing to protect her husband's property until he comes home."
Ulysses was washed and given a real shirt, as Minerva grew his figure to be taller and more muscular. She also made his hair much longer than before. He approached his wife, and complained about how distant she was being from him, but he called for the maid to prepare a bed of his own, away from Penelope's. Penelope told Eurycleia to move out the bridal bed for Ulysses to sleep on, which upset him to hear. He said that he made the bed himself, fashioned out of a big olive tree. To move this bed, someone would have had to have uprooted the entire tree. Penelope cried, as this was her test to tell whether or not the man was truly Ulysses, and he proved himself. She hugged and kissed her husband, explaining and apologizing for her scrutiny. Ulysses cried too.
As the sight of land is welcome to men who are swimming towards the shore, when Neptune has wrecked their ship with the fury of his winds and waves, a few alone reach the land, and these, covered with brine, are thankful when they find themselves on firm ground, and out of danger. Even so was her husband welcome to her, as she looked upon him, and she could not tear her two fair arms from about his neck.
Ulysses told Penelope that he had to set off from home again, to appease the prophecy seen by Tiresias. She asked him to elaborate further, so he told her that, back in Hades, Tiresias said that he would have to traverse the land carrying a wooden oar, where eventually he would meet a people who had never even heard of the sea before, where he would have to sacrifice a ram, a bull, and a boar to Neptune. And Tiresias said that one day he would die at sea, as an old man, happy and content with his place in the world. Penelope was glad to hear that Ulysses had many years ahead. At the end of this conversation, the two fell asleep in their bed. The next day, the couple talked to each other some more, Penelope telling him about how she had to bear the presence of the suitors for all these years, Ulysses telling her about his long and painful travels. She listened intently to everything from the attack on the Cicones, the land of the Lotus Eaters, the encounter with the Cyclops, his time with Aeolus, the Laestrygonians, of his time with Circe, the frightening house of Hades where he saw his mother, the singing of the Sirens, Charybdis and Scylla, the cattle of Hyperion, Calypso, and the Phaeacians. At the end of his story, Ulysses was so exhausted that he fell asleep once again. When he woke up, Minerva motivated him to get going to see Laertes. He told his wife to stay in her room and not to receive any visitors. With that, Ulysses put on his armor along with Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Philocius, and the four set off, as Minerva hid their presence amidst a dark cloud. Mercury guided the crying ghosts of the suitors down to Hades. Agamemnon, Ajax, and Achilles were discussing their fates when Mercury showed up with all the suitors. They were surprised to see them here, and Agamemnon asked Amphinomon how so many prestigious young men could have been killed at once. He recounted how they failed to court Penelope for so many years, until Ulysses and Telemachus had their revenge. Amphinomon said that, with how accurate all their shots were, it was obvious some god was helping them win the fight. Agamemnon was happy to hear how faithful Penelope had been to Ulysses, and said that the gods would sing praise of her, unlike Clytemnestra, and he reminded everyone he still felt very bitter towards her. Back in the overworld, the four men arrived at Laertes' little farm. Ulysses instructed the other three to go and kill one of his pigs for dinner, as he set off to look for his father, wondering if he'd recognize his son. Ulysses took off his armor, and soon found Laertes working the field. He was a very old man, wearing beaten-up clothes. Ulysses cried when he saw him. He went up to his father and complimented his farm and his skill, and asked him who his master was, and whether this place was really Ithaca. He went on to elaborate that he was a traveler, and had met the son of Laertes, who said that his family was from Ithaca. Hearing about Ulysses, Laertes started to cry. He said that this land had fallen to evil people after his son left, that his son was dead at sea, leaving his whole family depressed. Laertes asked how long ago this man had seen Ulysses, to which his son told him that it had been 5 years. The old man picked up some dust from the ground and let it fall over his head, to which Ulysses hugged his father and told him that he really was Ulysses, and that he was back after all this time, that all the suitors were killed. Laertes asked for some proof, so Ulysses showed him his scar and pointed out some fruit trees that his father gave to him when he was a boy. When he heard this, his father almost fell down, so Ulysses had to keep him propped up. Laertes thanked the gods, but he quickly turned his attention to the threat that the angry Ithacans would pose to them. They entered Laertes' house, where the other three were chopping up some meat for dinner. Laertes was washed, and Minerva gave him a little more bulk and height, which Ulysses commented on. Laertes told his son that if he were younger, he would have surely been there in the courtyard helping him slay the suitors. But dinner was ready, so they sat down and ate a bit, until the slave Dolius and his sons came into the hut. They were astonished to see Ulysses, who nonchalantly told them that they'd been waiting for him. He asked the king if Penelope knew, and Ulysses told him that they'd already met up and he didn't have anything to worry about. As they had their meal, everyone in Ithaca was hearing about how Ulysses returned and killed all the suitors. They found the bodies, some of which they buried, while those from other islands were shipped off on boats. An assembly was held, and Eupeithes, the father of Antinous, grieved terribly. He cried, talking about how Ulysses had doomed the men of Ithaca at Troy, and how he was killing them again now that he returned. He said that they had to avenge their deaths before Ulysses escaped to Pylos or Elis. Medon and Phemius arrived at the assembly, and everyone was surprised to see them alive. Medon described how he saw a god take the form of Mentor during the battle, so this was clearly something that was willed by the heavens. Then Halitherses said that this was actually the fault of the Ithacan men, as none of them would listen to him or Mentor earlier when they warned them about all this. He told the crowd not to try and fight Ulysses, that nothing good would come of it. About half of the crowd were still upset, so they got some weapons and armor, with Eupeithes leading them onwards. Seeing all this happen, Minerva in Olympus asked her father Jove what the best thing to do was, to keep them fighting or to make peace. He said that she could do whatever she wanted, but that, in his opinion, it would be best to let Ulysses be king again, and make all the others forget about the deaths of the suitors, and just let everybody get along. This was what she already wanted to do, so she quickly headed down to Ithaca. As they finished their dinner, Ulysses told one of Dolius' sons to go out and see if anyone was approaching, and he saw the big angry mob, so he told the others that they had to get their armor on immediately. All of them wore the armor, including the old men, as they followed Ulysses forward. Minerva arrived, and taking the form of Mentor, she told Laertes to hurl his spear as far as he could. She made him powerful, and he threw the blade forth. It landed on Eupeithes' helmet, piercing the armor and killing him instantly. Ulysses and Telemachus began to fight against the mob, and they would have killed them all if Minerva hadn't stayed their hand. She told the crowd to put an end to their fighting, and now being very intimidated by the goddess, they all obliged, dropping their weapons and running back to the city. Ulysses cried out and chased the men, but Jove threw down lightning right by Minerva. She told him to stop fighting, or else he'd incur the wrath of Jove.
Thus spoke Minerva, and Ulysses obeyed her gladly. Then Minerva assumed the form and voice of Mentor, and presently made a covenant of peace between the two contending parties.